All right, welcome everyone to the last panel in a very, very exciting, rich week, International Archives Week hosted by Milli Network. Uh, it's been such a diversity of issues and sessions, and just we've been fed so many things that now I think is the question of how do we use it. And it's only fitting that this final panel be on pedagogy. The question which somebody had asked through the week was, who are the archives for, right? And clearly, as much as we want the answer to be everyone, one prime user of the archives are students. The usability of archives to a broader audience is often thought of in terms of universities, college spaces, and such. And traditionally, we have inherited this idea that it's the postgraduate PhD scholar who accesses the archives and then renders them perhaps to the rest of the world. For us, the university is but a space of formality. And pedagogy is just a tool in some sense to enable re-narration and amplify public memory for all. Educators in universities and colleges often are able to provide context, but really the sessions that we've seen this week tell us that to provide that context, there's such a range of issues that we also have to account for. So sessions this week have touched on questions of protocol, interoperability, oral history, community memory, annotation, right? And even the question of archival silence. So it's been quite the week. And to sort of bring all of this to bear on not only the classroom, but a sort of public humanities facing, effort requires a lot of deliberation across a lot of stakeholders. So many projects, inquiries are coming forth from the revelations of this week. And in a way, it's been a prelude to building up the infrastructure for more archival effort and access. There is no doubt that we need to tell new stories, and for that, we need to be looking at different sources. The archives are often a start point, and we are now also hearing voices from a diversity of spaces that wasn't possible, honestly, before digital archives. So I want to sort of put this on the record. This event has been almost zero cost, paperless, without carbon emission, and would not have been possible without having digital platforms enable this. In a way, today's session is specifically on the what we call affordances, right, of these digital spaces and how archives are now able to enter classrooms and be accessed by different audiences that don't often require visiting a physical location in order to access material. So this is what our panel will be about. I'll just hand it over to Swetcha, who's the tech lead for today, to make some housekeeping announcements, and then we'll get on the road. Over to you, Swetcha.
Good morning, all. I'm Swetcha logging into Milli Network today, and I'll be your tech lead. Firstly, I'd like to request the audience to keep your microphones on mute and switch off your videos. In case you have any questions and comments for the speakers, please post them in the chat box, but kindly keep them civil and respectful. You can also use the raise hand option available to you and drop it once your question has been answered. And may I also request the panelists to mute your mics after you've done speaking, but please leave the video on. In case you have any tech-related questions or any concerns, please don't hesitate to ping me. You'll find me as Milli Network in your chat box. Thank you so much and welcome to today's session. Handing over to Maya.
Thank you so much, Swetcha. This entire week has been possible because of the volunteer spirit that animates so many of the people in Milli Network, and we'll hope to give thanks at the end of the session. So we begin today with Swati Chawla. Swati teaches at OP Jindal Global University. She has been trained as a digital humanist and has incorporated what are called DH, digital humanities tools, in her research and teaching. She was one of the developers of Ivanhoe, which is a digital platform for collaborative textual interpretation. And she also worked as a pedagogy specialist for the University of Virginia's digital humanities curriculum. She supervised student projects employing geospatial DH tools such as ArcGIS and Google Earth. So over to you, Swati. You're on mute, sorry.
Okay, good morning, everybody. And thank you for joining us on a Sunday morning. And thank you, Maya, for inviting me to the panel and also for welcoming me into the Milli Network. I've learned so much from everyone this week. And it's been also great to support the effort in a small way. So I'm talking to you today about two examples, both from this semester of bringing the archives into my undergraduate and now virtual classroom. So first, a little context. I work in a liberal arts and humanities department with a strong focus on interdisciplinary learning, where we don't yet have a history major. So the first example that I'm giving you today is from a course called History Foundations, which is a compulsory course that all our incoming freshmen take. And for many of them, it's the only history course that they would take in their undergrad career. This course is designed collaboratively among the 4 historians in our department, and we each teach one section of it. It comprises 6 modules. So we begin with a study of the deep past with our resident archaeologist, Professor Chris Hale. And then we go on to the Indus Valley civilization, early Islam, Renaissance, and scientific revolution, and then the late colonial period in South Asia, and also the first 3 decades after independence. So we sort of really go from the deep past right up to the emergency in the space of a semester. So each of these modules aims to bring students into, workshop them into reading and telling a story from a different kind of historical source. So that's how the archives come in. The other sources we use are, we have a simulation of an archaeological site with pottery, metal, and skeletal remains. We have Renaissance paintings and philosophical treatises. Also closer to us in time and space, colonial maps, Bharat Mata calendar art, pamphlets, constituent assembly debates, songs and films, oral histories from the 1947 partition archive, and finally, propaganda videos from the films division in the 50s and 60s. And in the conclusion, actually, just yesterday, we ended with Mile Sur Mera Tumhara, which was from 1988. So now just coming to the archives and what we did. So our sessions on partition ran across partition and its long shadow on citizenship in South Asia that run across the last 2 modules, both on the late colonial and the post-colonial period. And this is usually the time when we take our students, on a bus from Sonipat to central Delhi, and we bring them to the National Archives, IGNCA, the Nehru Memorial, and some of the smaller archives in Delhi. But since that wasn't possible this semester, we thought we would bring the archives in and we would sort of teach them, we would give them one archival document and we would read it together and hopefully teach them how to read this together. So this was a workshop that we designed. It was a 2-hour workshop for each of our sections that I designed with my colleague, Laurence Gautier. And let me just actually dive straight into it. So let's see, screen share. Yeah. Okay, let's go on full screen. So like I said, I designed this with my colleague who you see here. And we took it sort of in 2 batches of 2 sections each. Before the workshop, we prepared our students. So I'll just sort of, since it's a pedagogy session, tell you how we did it and how we read this one archival document. So in the class before the workshop, we gave the students a kind of a reading aid. So remember, again, these are first-year undergrads, straight out of high school. I've never seen an archival document. So this was a document, it's an application for citizenship of a Kashmiri woman. It's from the 1960s. So she applies to Jammu and Kashmir, through the Jammu and Kashmir state, to the Ministry of Home Affairs, Indian citizenship section. She applies for citizenship. And briefly, her biography is that she was a subject of the Jammu and Kashmir state. Now, of course, we're all historians here. We remember the history of the integration of J&K state into India. So she was a subject of the state. Then her father migrates to Karachi after the partition. She goes to visit her father. She returns to J&K. She gets married to again, a resident of the a subject of the J&K state. She gets married, visits her father again, this time for a period of 7 years. And then when she returns, she applies for citizenship. So it's that application and all the paraphernalia around that application. It's a 37-page document, and the whole workshop is focused on this one document. Now, just before this workshop, we had studied the partition. We'd read a little bit of Urvashi Butalia. We looked at the 1947 partition archive, looked at some of the maps and census data because we talked about the drawing up of the Radcliffe line. But right before this, we read from Wazira Zamindar's book, The Long Partition, and particularly the chapter on Ghulam Ali, where Wazira Zamindar also uses archival documents and she traces people's journeys over a period of time, and hence the argument about the long partition. So we wanted to show students how historians use these sources to tell a story. So they had just read that narrative in Zamindar's book, and then we wanted to show them just one of the kinds of documents or the kind of documents that went into writing that book. So we gave them a reading aid, which, some acronyms that they encounter in the document. We told them this is it's a very simple, relatively simple document. It's the story of one person. So try and map it in time and space as you go. I'm just going to put my clock here so I don't lose track of time. And then, we sort of told them, we gave them a few questions. So these were the questions that they answered on Slido. So those of us who've been teaching virtually might have come across this platform. So it's a quizzing platform where students can answer questions, and then you can aggregate the results and show them together when you take the class. So these were the questions. Identify what are the three identities of the petitioner. So she's Kashmiri, she's a woman, she's Muslim. What are her motives for crossing the border? What are the documents that she uses? So the file, since it's 37 pages, has all of these documents that she uses to cross the border and the documents she needs to submit. We tried to tell students that although this is one file, just in the materiality of this file, it comprises different kinds of documents, and try and disaggregate them. So there is a form 11 for citizenship. There is an affidavit. There are attestations of people who are attesting to the veracity of her claim, to the correctness of her claim. There is a birth certificate. There is a travel permit. There's a letter from the Prime Minister of Jammu and Kashmir at the time extending her travel permit. So try and disaggregate the different kinds of documents. Also try and disaggregate the different levels of government, because students often tend to talk about the state. And I think an archival document is a very good source that helps us disaggregate these. So there is the Ministry of Home Affairs where this document is housed. But even within the MHA, the different departments make an appearance in the file. So there's the Intelligence Bureau, the Finance Department, the Indian Citizenship Section, then the J&K state, and different departments of the J&K state. So I think it's a very, it's a good example to help them disaggregate the imperatives of these different documents. And then we asked them for one word that they would use to describe this application for citizenship. So before we sort of left them with this document, I took them through just 2 pages, and I tried to show how sometimes even each page has multiple authors. And really, this is a scanned copy since we couldn't take them to the archives. It's scanned from a photocopy. So it's also sort of telling them about the history of that, like how this document came to be on your PowerPoint slide, but what are the things to note, who are the multiple authors, etc. So that's the work the students did right before class. Then in the workshop, we again took them through the different themes. So I mean, this, of course, I'm just trying to, again, give you the experience, simulating what it was like for an undergrad to be here. So this was one of the documents that are, that Tahira Jabin, whose case we read, produced to cross the borders, and they read about this in the Zamindar chapter. Then we also went through all the different articles of the Citizenship Act that make an appearance, and what are the requirements under each of these articles, what are the requirements that the petitioner for citizenship has to fulfill. So we went through the act. So this is the first page. This is the title of the file. And again, since it was undergrads, we sort of took them through each of these things. What is IC, the file number, for example. IC stands for Indian citizenship. 60 here is the year. At some point, it was transferred to the National Archives. Then yesterday, Ali was talking about weeding. So this was one of those documents that, they decided to keep. So it says keep here. And at some point, it gets declassified. We told our students about the trail of references in an archival document. So for example, here there is a reference to another archival file. When this person applies for a permit, and this is when the border regime changes before she gets a passport. So she makes an appearance in that file in the Kashmir section, another MHA file. So there was that. We read about, again, the act. She applies under section 51C, which applies to married women. So a woman who's married to an Indian national applying for citizenship by naturalization. So we talked about that. So this was when the one word that our students had when they read this document. So we said, in one word, describe the process of applying for citizenship, and tedious was the word. It's tedious, lengthy, exhausting, thorough. When I saw this, I thought the archives have spoken. This is sort of, you infect them with the archival, but and yet exciting, this, because you get really invested in her journey. You go through these 37 pages. Did she make it? Did she not? Was she accepted? What happened? So this was the one word that they had. And here it tells you that 50 of them participated in this poll. So these were her identities, the kind of documents, etc. It's just very quickly showing you. And then we divided in the workshop, we divided students into 5 groups, and then they each took half an hour to go through, and we divided the class into groups depending on the 5 themes, which were crossing the border, the petitioning process, the definition of citizenship, how does being a woman affect the outcome, and how does being a Muslim affect the outcome. So they read the document a second time, and this time they looked for specific answers to questions. So let me actually show you, and I'm going to end in just a minute. One more screen, just showing you the work they did during the workshop. So this is the Slido platform, and this is just one of their polls here. And this is the poll on crossing the border. So the group that worked on crossing the border, they answered these 9 questions, and the answers are sort of spread across the 37 pages. So going through the document once more. Where does the petitioner come from? You would think it's a straightforward answer, but it's not. There might be different places mentioned in her permit, in her Form 11, and in her final application for citizenship. So each of these is also a conversation starter. How many times does she cross the border? Again, not a straightforward answer. It's confusing. When, with whom, what documents does she use? What are her reasons? Her reasons are different from the administration. So her reason in her affidavit is different from the reason the MHA gives to the Jammu and Kashmir state in their correspondence. Okay, so it's sort of like, just in that space of one document, you would have 3 different versions on why she's crossing the border and why she wants to live in India. So, I mean, again, just showing them the richness of like just a regular archival document. So let me go back to my original slide and then conclude. Now I can't find that slide. I think this is where it is. Right. So, and then finally, after they did this work in their Slido polls, we brought them together. And this time, we left them with slightly more analytical questions. So the first stage, the pre-workshop stage, was familiarizing themselves with the document, disaggregating it, and, identifying its various parts. The second stage was looking for answers to thematic questions in the document. And the third stage was analyzing from the document. So what does this document tell us about the Indo-Pak border? What does this tell you about belonging, identity, and citizenship? What does it tell you about the petitioning process? What does it tell you about the 2 conceptions of citizenship? And that's where we spend so much time in our class. The jus soli, which is the right of soil, and the jus sanguinis, which is birth or blood right. So there is a tension between these two ideas of citizenship, and they read this in their secondary sources, in Neerja Jayal, for example. But the document actually shows you the tension between these two ideas. So she is born in India, in JNK, and yet there is the jus sanguinis creeping into that, because she's a Muslim and she spent 7 years in Pakistan. There is the idea that perhaps she does not belong in India and she belongs back in Pakistan. So that's the kind of work we did. And in the last 30 seconds, I just want to tell you about how students responded to this. So we ended the workshop, and in the following class, I asked them to reflect on the different kinds of sources we had used to study the partition. And we are lucky with the partition because we have such rich sources. In the look, for example, at Satish Gujral's paintings, in the 1947 partition archives, the oral histories are such rich sources. The films, they read Toba Tek Singh, they read Amrita Pritam's Call to Varisha. But I think they could feel what it is for a person to navigate state machinery through the document, and I think that's something. I came to history after 10 years in literary studies, and I think the archives made me a historian. So I mean, this is with all their limitations. It's a traditional government, it's an MHA source, doesn't get more straightforward than that. But I think it really does tell you in a very tangible way, what is it like to do the back and forth, to make a petition, to get a response 6 months later, your date of birth is wrong, reapply. And just that process, that bureaucracy, reminded me of Kundera, our only immortality is in the police files. And you sort of see that, and I'll end with that. Thank you.
Wow, Swati, thank you. I can't think of a more timely pedagogical exercise, right, at the time when all the stuff that was going on with
With the
protests.
CAA, that, yes. And I think also, thank you, Maya, sorry, just telling students, this is what it would mean if you had to prove your citizenship. It's not straight, like this is what it means. And in some of these cases, you don't know if they were naturalized at the end or not. So you just say, I hope you made it.
Absolutely.
So I think that the horror of it also really strikes them.
Absolutely. No, I think this is where, like you said, you've moved from narrative into deeper sort of historical, archival work. And I think this is a great segue to Nonica, who has taken the historical into the narrative also, right? So we need those passages across disciplines, and we definitely need to introduce it in a much more tangible fashion, right, to our own students. So Nonica, over to you. If you can unmute your mic, I'll just introduce you very briefly. Nonica Datta teaches history at JNU Delhi. She received her PhD from Cambridge and previously taught at Miranda House, and has been a fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and the Museum and Library in Delhi. She's also been a visiting professor at the universities of St. Gallen and Humboldt. Her publications include Forming an Identity, A Social History of the Jats, and Violence, Martyrdom, and Partition, A Daughter's Testimony, which was shortlisted for the Crossword Award in 2012. Over to you, Nonica.
Well, I just got 10 minutes, and thank you very much for inviting me, Maya and Aparna, and making me part of this wonderful community of scholars and students, and also I think people not from any disciplinary backgrounds who are probably participating in this forum. And I'm really an archivist, and I'm really enthused to be opening up a new kind of, a conversation across disciplines and across the boundaries of the archive, as it were. Let me tell you, I began by thinking of actually incorporating certain digital sites for the convenience of talking about pedagogical practices and the uses of the digital archive in the present times, when we can't actually go to the physical archive, when we can't access the National Archives, and students can't go to Nehru Memorial Museum and write their seminar papers. But then, and while I was doing my online lectures for a few weeks, and I was sharing these sites with my students, especially the Stanford site on the French Revolution, the Brown University site on women's histories, the Partition Museum in Amritsar, and the Stanford collection of the Partition Archive in Stanford, by Gunita Bhalla, and of course the Cambridge University archive on the epidemics. And we were in the classroom in the Zoom meeting talking about when the historical context undergoes transformation, the notion of the archive somewhat remains the same, but the sources undergo transitions. The new kinds of sources are introduced into the archive. So when you had in the 19th century, the colonial archive talking about the land revenue settlements, that was the time when land systems became very important. And then in the early part, when you had the Spanish influenza, medical journals became very important. And then of course, with the partition of 1947, you had a new kind of political archive emerging in the various record rooms and also in the Home Ministry. However, having said that, when this context, the historical context and contingency all shapes the archival source, but the idea of the archive as a coercive idea, as an oppressive idea, and as an equation between the state, the historian, and the archive, the kind of equation that we work with, that remains absolutely fundamental to our understanding of the archive. And what historians, whether from a radical kind of a perspective, writing on women's histories, partition histories, or subaltern histories, somehow, somewhat, including me, tend to reaffirm that archival paradigm, which is a very coercive, it's a violent paradigm, if I may submit. A paradigm which is an exclusive paradigm. It excises, it erases, it silences, right? I mean, we talk about silencing in the archives. I mean, I'll come back to that point if I have time. But the paradigm is coercive, it's oppressive. So then how do we dismantle that paradigm in a classroom? How do we engage with that equation in the classroom when the state, the historian, and the archive come together in such a remarkably coercive way? There's a nexus. I feel there's a nexus, between the historian, the state, and the archive. And that's the politics of the archive. And how do we then introduce that paradigm, the archival paradigm, to the students, right? Do we then continue to reaffirm it, reinforce it, or how do we then question it is an important question, I think, that we need to pose. Whether we support the traditional archive, the physical archive, or the non-traditional digitization process, which is a remarkable process of conserving, preserving, and also perpetuating the archival paradigm. So I think there's a need to get out of that paradigm. We need to dilute that paradigm. So when we talk about the dilution of that paradigm, then of course the problem remains, how do we do it? There are many ways, but there is no formula for that. Of course, we have writers here, literary theorists here, artists here, musicians here, who have really enriched the idea of the archive and also dismantled that coercive archival paradigm. You have the Rupayan Sansthan, for example, in Rajasthan, in Jodhpur, which was set up by Komal Kothari. And he actually set out not only to catalog and document the histories, oral histories of Rajasthan, but he also had a conversation with the livelihoods of the Rajasthani people. So he was talking about education, etc., etc. But I'll give you a small example. When I spoke to Komal Kothari's son, Kuldeep Kothari, and he was very conscious of the fact that, there is a kind of a need to preserve this entire oral archive, and his father did this remarkable job of collecting the lok kathas, the Mangniyars, oral traditions, etc. But when I spoke to the Mangniyar musicians of Jaisalmer, some of them, especially, one of them, Khete Khan Mangniyar, I interviewed him, and he told me, look, they silenced something, kuch kho gaya usme. What they did, there was a sense of loss, kuch kho gaya, jo hua, usme hamara nahi tha. It was for them. So, this is just a small example of the loss in the archive itself, of that lived history, of that oral testimony. And right. I mean, we as historians are always reinforcing the archival paradigm, but we don't know the violence we are doing to lived histories through that archival paradigm. So the constitution of the archive, unless and until we question, dismantle, dilute that constitution of the archive itself, I don't think that we are in for a very fruitful, creative, critical intervention with the archive. And unless we dismantle or dilute it, I think we're just going to then reinforce, whether it's the, Nora kind of paradigm. Pierre Nora said that the memory that we get in the archive is the archived memory, not going to get the lived memory in the archive. He made a distinction between the archival memory and the lived memory. And in France, after the French Revolution, the lived memory did not exist. But in South Asia, it exists. We live with oral histories, we live with genealogies, we live with kathas, we live with musicians and their histories. We live with medical doctors coming and looking at, a particular kind of an archival source with a different kind of detective eye, right? But we don't have those conversations. So my second point is that how to make that archival paradigm of historian state and history a more inclusive, a more participatory, a more transparent project than what it is. And for that to happen, we need to open it to the layman, to the layperson, to the laywoman, to the artist, to the musician. So everybody should have an access to the archive. Archive is not for the historian alone. And let's not sort of think, that we are in this very inflated position of actually using it and then reinforcing the archival paradigm. We don't know the kind of violence we might be doing to the lived histories. So that brings me, so make it participatory, make it inclusive. And that's a question that I'm posing. And the third is that, of course, there needs to be a conversation between the archive and the common person. It's not only accessing that archive, but a conversation. The conversation between the lived history, because the archive silences the lived history, the lived voice. And that conversation could indeed be made possible through digitization also. Partition Museum is doing that. Partition Archive, which Gunita Bhalla talks about, is doing that. And these intentions, these projects are not coming from history. By the way, they are not historians who are doing it. These are not the historians who are recovering the partition voices. These are actually writers, scholars, people who are outside the disciplinary boundaries of history, right? Remember, the partition histories were written by Butalia and Menon, who were feminist scholars. They were not historians, right? So in a way, these interventions came from outside the confining, restrictive domain of history writing, which does somewhat remains confined to the statist paradigm, whether subaltern or whether sort of more traditional nationalist paradigm. So the conversation between the lived and the archival, paradigm, lived history and the archival paradigm is absolutely crucial at this stage. We are sitting at a crossroads and we need to address this. It's a serious matter. The common person does not need the archive the way the historian needs the archive, perhaps. There were instances being given in the previous lecture. Let me give you a small example also. And the historian's history is also to a large extent irrelevant for the common person. She is not going to use it, she's not going to have a conversation very easily, a conversation with the historian's history. It has not happened. Let's accept that in the South Asian context, it has not happened. We have not been able to do that. We have not been able to have a popular conversations. Our histories are indeed academic histories. I was in Amritsar the other day and I got a call from somebody in Jhelum, happened to know him through social media. And he told me that if you are going to the MCD office, the Municipal Committee, Commission of Corporation office in Amritsar, can you help me get the Shajra of my family? Shajra is a village map. And I was taken aback because my mind was that of a researcher working on urban history. So I was thinking, okay, I'm looking at public health records, I'm looking at the civic authorities, but what is this Shajara doing here? Oh, of course, he wants to know about the land settlements at that time. No, he wanted to know about his family history. He wanted to know about the genealogy of his family. So, right, and for me, when I go to the MCD records, I'm looking for an official document. I would never think of looking for a Shajara. Shajara for me would be probably in the family mosque, you know, and not in the MCD department, right? So his identification of the MCD record as that containing the Shajara is an important, intuitive connection, right? He's forging a connection with that MCD office. So where are these other insights that, why can't we have these conversations with people at large about the archives? So let's not be intimidated by the record, and let's not protect it, right? Let's get out of that protection business, and let's actually, I'm glad that archival sources, archival documents are being taught at familiarized with at the undergraduate level. Even at the school level, there should be a consciousness among school children about the archive, right? There should be a kind of an access to the archive, both physical and digital, so that we don't remain exclusive in the zone of insularity and in the zone of power, and politics, where archive is seen to be something sacrosanct and only to be used by historians and, to hone their methodologies and their perspectives. I don't know, I just thought that I would like to share some of these thoughts, therefore, to then reinforce and give importance to the ways in which digital interventions have been quite liberating, because they have been sort of, somewhat in a way questioning or in a way diluting the status paradigm. And especially the interventions that are coming from artists, literary theorists, writers, and even people making or constituting their own archives. I think these are very worthy, very important interventions. And that's why yesterday I talked about the idea of conceiving, a kind of a virtual archive of United Punjab, which would be of people's archive, people sort of talking about their suffering, their angst, their pain, their testimonies, their feelings, not just of partition, but of being kind of dispossessed from, their lands, and also their experiences of living in post-colonial worlds, right? So a kind of an experience, a kind of, testimonies that could be perhaps, digitized, or, students can be encouraged to constitute different types of archives or engage with different kinds of archives. And I always tell my students, so there are 2 points actually, a kind of a dismantling or the dilution of the archival paradigm, the coercive, violent paradigm of archives, and the huge nexus between the state historian and the archive. And then the ability to move beyond that and start a very meaningful, creative, open, transparent, enabling, open conversation with lived histories and people. So that's something I think would perhaps liberate us from these shackles of, the obsession with the archive, the Derrida archival fever, and we might just protect. We don't want to be protectionists about these archives. We don't have to protect it, for God's sake. We've done that enough. We've had enough of those discourses. Now time is to kind of move forward and perhaps, with humility, talk to people, make them access the archives, let them have access to the archives, and new paradigms will emerge, new skills will emerge, new ways of engaging with the archive will emerge, new pedagogies will emerge. I'm sure there'll be new pedagogies beyond the classroom, and they'll be beyond the classroom. We'll really liberate it and make it a very democratic space.
Yeah.
I think I've exceeded my time, and I'll stop here. And then, maybe I can come back later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nonica. Wow. I mean, seriously, we don't be intimidated by the archive, right? I think in a sense, we're all in awe of the rigor and all these sort of pretend, authoritative structures that surround the archive. So I cannot think of a better person to help us move away from that paradigm to a lived paradigm. Kush Patel is next. And Kush, I'll just briefly introduce you. Kush Patel is Associate Professor of Architecture and the Humanities at Avani Institute of Design. They are an architect as well as a theorist and historian of social space, participatory politics, and engaged pedagogy, working at the intersections of architecture and the digital public humanities. Their focus is on anti-colonial, queer, and feminist digital humanities. Prior to joining Avani, Dr. Patel held academic appointments as Associate Faculty Librarian of Digital Pedagogy and was at the Institute for the Humanities at the University of Michigan. So over to you, Kush, to take this conversation forward. Thanks.
Right. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Swati, Nonica. What a way to start this day with your incredible insights and the work that you've been doing in the context of institutions, with students, with communities, both within and beyond academia. It's been quite an incredible week of engagements with the archive, and I was thinking what a fitting way to sort of conclude it on this note of learning through archives. As a way to sort of highlight this ongoing process and commitment to learning, relearning, unlearning, and co-learning as a community. I also want to thank the organizers of the symposium, Winkit Srinivasan, the Milli Group, Maya, for inviting me to be part of this panel. And I want to thank all of the wonderful presenters, co-panelists here, as well as those that have come before us throughout this week. It's just been a riveting week. I've been taking notes and just so much to think through and think about as we move to either teaching through archives or practices that are on the creative end of the spectrum with archives. And last but not least, I also sort of want to give a virtual shout out to all of my students, since this is a pedagogy panel. Students who both past and present, who make this work both meaningful and possible for me, as well as the communities that I engage with. I'll begin sharing my slideshow. Just pardon me, there are a lot of visuals in the slideshow, so I may sort of do a kind of an autoplay of slides just to be able to sort of connect the dots throughout the narrative. Let me begin by first sharing it. Oh. Great. I could see my slides, but not anymore. So let me just pull it up. Okay, here. It's great. Is everybody able to see the slides? Yeah. So the talk is brief, but it's focused around this idea of anti-colonial archival praxis in and with the digital. And I'll start by positioning my pedagogy as praxis. Praxis that is informed by an ongoing interest in the relationships between spatial politics, community histories, and my own queer feminist positionalities. A praxis that grows out of an anti-colonial digital humanities collective called Pedagogy of the Digitally Oppressed, which is a collective that I co-run with my colleagues and friends currently at the University of Toronto, Ashley Caranto-Morford and Aaron Jacob. And a praxis that is oriented towards questions of accountability and trust building, both within, but also with specific non-academic communities that we engage with. And while this positioning has allowed me to sort of reimagine, or rather what this positioning has allowed me to do is to reimagine the archive beyond what Nonica was saying, this colonial or colonizing repository formations exclusive to scholarly audiences, exclusive for scholarly work, and towards approaching the archive instead as a set of lived-in knowledge-producing sites and practices with emancipatory potentials for non-academic communities that often constitute my own classrooms. So my classrooms, when I teach, it's not just the student community that is part of the institution, but I bring in communities beyond academia as a way to sort of co-produce knowledge, as a way to think through lived-in archives and lived-in infrastructures, which can allow my work, again, at the intersection of architecture and humanities, to take a much more expansive form, but a much more critical tone as well. So what I'll do is I'm going to share this question of what does such archive look like? What does an anti-colonial archival praxis, what might that begin to look like, as opposed to sort of it being a solidified formation? And I'll share two examples. One is an example of integrating a popular digital public archive into an undergraduate interdisciplinary seminar that I taught at the University of Michigan. And the second is an early attempt. It's a very early attempt at outlining the possibilities of what scholars like Kimberly Christian have referred to as slow archives, which I'll be discussing briefly in the context of another undergraduate urban humanities design studio that I just finished teaching at Avani. But before I expand upon these examples, I do want to cite one other work that continues to be an important conceptual and methodological reference for me and my students in its commitment to both democratizing and liberating the archive. And here I'm referring to the project led by Chicana feminist activist Professor Maria Cotera and Linda Garcia Merchant, her Afro-Chicana filmmaker collaborator, and the project is called Chicana por mi Raza. I'm happy to share the links in the discussion section, but it's an incredible archive that really puts this thought of what does it mean to liberate the archive from beyond the confines of the institution, move to the domestic sphere, think through Chicana feminist histories between the mid-60s and the mid-80s, and bring all of that content to bear upon teaching, or involve students in the construction of the archive enough to not just build the archive, but also build themselves into the history and writing of that archive. But coming back to my own course, the Plot Beneath the Garden was an interdisciplinary seminar. And again, you know, the opportunity here was to sort of invite students, not just from art and design and architecture, but because the course met with programming the environment, women's studies, and American culture, it was a deliberate intersectional feminist approach to thinking through questions of urban gardening in the context of Detroit. And so we partnered with, let me just see, we partnered with Oakland Avenue Urban Farm at North End district of Detroit. It's an incredible community, a very small African-American community that's been cultivating on plots of land, co-owning them over a period of time. And there was already a kind of a collaboration existing between Anya Sirota, who was then the associate professor at Tubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. And so I sort of wanted to build upon an existing connection between the school and the community, but instead of sort of focusing on the design build aspects of architecture and or making, we sort of oriented the course around digital storytelling. And digital storytelling, not for the sake of, but as a way to sort of engage community gardeners such as Oakland Avenue Urban Farm and put them in conversation with the Smithsonian's National Archive called the Community of Gardens. So I'll get to that very quickly, but this is to say that the course was structured both as a field intensive digital storytelling, community oral history, undergraduate seminar, but all towards sort of building stories with the community and then sort of pausing and thinking how, in what ways might the students begin to grapple with their own role and facilitation in the process of really making this archive public. So the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm, you know, again, there was a wealth of sort of documentation that was ongoing through the previous collaboration between the architecture faculty and the community. And what we focused on are objects, whether they're objects of cultivation, whether they are stories that connect to those objects, or whether there are the stories that connect to the objects and the people, and ways in which each of these stories could then be made part of an internal, what we created a kind of a website, as a way to sort of both introduce the students, but also the community members, who they are, what are their biographies, how might we begin to unpack their biographies as a way to then see what are the politics of cultivating a garden in the context of Detroit and imagining a future through their lens. The processes, as I said, you know, the classroom was not just located on campus, but it was literally on site in the field. This was during the cold winter months in Michigan, and we still were able to sort of think through what does it mean to then retreat and really use this term as a space of reflection to really grapple with the qualitative, the historical, the lived experiential dimensions of cultivators, and then sort of bring those cultivators, this is Jerry Hebron, back to the classroom as we talk about what does it mean to then work with lived histories. And so this was a reciprocal process as a way to build a kind of a very intimate archive of lived memories, of stories that connect to the practices of urban gardening, but then also challenge this conventions of urban gardening as a very harmonious imperative, and really make visible how deeply social and deeply political this whole process can be. And the ultimate the objective was that through a series of discussions, documentations, because these students, again, they came with a range of skills. And I also want to mention that students were diverse. There were first generation students. There were students from Metro Detroit. There were students from Detroit. There were students from outside of Michigan. There were mostly upper level freshmen, and then a few juniors and seniors, but this was also the first understanding of how to begin to think of the archive, not within the confines of the library or a special collections or a building, but an archive as it sort of lives in the homes and practices, daily practices of communities that are trying to envision a better future for themselves. And so the work involved actually sort of doing the handwork of tilling the land or working with them to be able to sort of, again, model the practices that they were archiving and documenting all at the same time. But all of that, it was to sort of continuously critically engage this digital public archive, which was a project that is still alive and was started by the Smithsonian in 2012. It's an Omeka project, and it's a very easy to access website and resource, which is inviting or continues to invite community gardeners from around the country in the US to upload their stories. To upload stories either in text form, in image form, in video files, and begin to sort of talk about what does it mean to take care of each other, to sort of what does it mean to imagine very localized, hyper-local futures, but also put them in a national narrative. And what we using this kind of feminist methodology of grappling with power differentials, not just between genders, but also between academic and non-academic groups, it is remarkable to hear the students themselves take a pause and say that we cannot be uploading stories or we cannot be speaking for the community, but we would rather sort of engage this archive critically. So around midpoint in the semester, what we did was, as much as a kind of a microspatial archive was being formed in the context of the classroom, we were also engaging the digital public archive critically. How is it made? What are its different components? And in what ways is it really inclusive of the stories that are part of its narrative? And so this was a highly collaborative process, which ultimately led to students not, again, uploading content to the archive, but literally writing open letters to the Smithsonian, incorporating some of those lived histories and proposing definitive strategies in collaboration with the community partners of how to open up the archive so that hyper-local microspatial histories could also be part of the archive, which are currently not the case. So that's one sort of example of how the archive entered my classroom in an interdisciplinary setup where the sort of the ambitions and backgrounds were diverse, but also, again, sort of not take the archive or the digital archive as a given object, and really have students grapple with that object critically, and then take a step back and really demonstrate or model what reciprocity and mutually beneficial relationships look like between the academia or academic community and the university. The other example is from a more recent studio at Avani Institute of Design, which is where I started last monsoon. And this was an opportunity to sort of lead an upper level undergraduate studio. So studio in the context of architecture schools is typically sort of a 16-week intensive where you sort of engage with a particular context and look at its physicality, but also its sociocultural backgrounds. And here was an opportunity to sort of say, what might an urban humanities studio do in the context of what we picked Virnium, which is a port community located south of Trivandrum, and under tremendous risk from displacement and removal based on a very large-scale transshipment project, the Adani project that is coming up very in close quarters to these communities. And so instead of sort of approaching it like a typical design studio and sort of parachuting down onto lands and thinking where is the opportunity to design and then sort of propose alternatives, here was an opportunity to say, how can we sort of remodel the studio so that 2/3 of the studio is literally spent and looking at the sort of the critical dimensions of the landscape, or landscape becoming an archive to work with. And that and this was a tweet that I had posted last August, which was again to say that the week was marked by losses, the loss of land, of dignity, of lives through racial and colonial violence. So I was trying to sort of do a kind of a longitudinal kind of a cross section of Kashmir, Toni Morrison, Dayton, El Paso. There were all kinds of losses that were sort of being documented and talked about during that week. And as I was listening to students grapple with their own questions of agency as potential future architects, the imperative I asked was to build a critique of the settler colonial infrastructure in the form of a large transshipment project, and really have students take very critical positions of not where is design, but rather what is design, or what is their role in this context. And so 2/3 of the studio was actually spent in extensively documenting the context, and not just for the sake of, but against this framework of settler colonialism. And settler colonialism, which is about occupation of land, but is active occupation of land and displacement of communities that have been there for generations. And these recordings were bilinguals in both Malayalam and in English, as a way to sort of then begin to create oral histories, oral archives. And we also partnered with the Coastal Students Cultural Forum, CSCF, which is a local organization that has been working in that community for several years now, thinking about climate change, the large-scale capitalist developments, and the impact of both of these forces on communities. And so it was a triangulated effort between sort of thinking through policy, but also thinking through local community organizing efforts, and then positioning ourselves as critical spatial thinkers that can also give form and language to the change that is happening. And so the kinds of stories that emerged, these are some of the process works that were not just in terms of graphical transects, but also oral histories. And we started putting them down as kind of long drawn landscapes of change and documentation, and literally at a scale that you can start to inhabit them even when you're not part of the community. We invited community activists to be part of the studio as a way to then begin to sort of see the landscape from a different lens, and then sort of provide a critique of how, to what extent are those lived histories really becoming real and potentially sort of being one is able to find some kind of a liberating or emancipatory potential in these critical insights that are oriented towards the community, but also oriented towards the future. And so this question of what is our ethical imperative as students, educators, and practitioners of architecture in connection with such ground realities, how might we pay attention to the colonial legacies pervading contemporary urban developments, and at which scale, with which questions might we engage the implicated lived histories? These were the pressing questions that structured the entire semester, or as one of my students, Ashif Salim, put bluntly, within such context of colonization, whose lives are we drawing for? So even this idea of creating these microspatial histories and archiving them was not just taken for granted. Students began to literally sort of grapple with the urgency of the question, and then also be critical of their own agency and privilege that comes with being part of an academic institution. And just because they're students of architecture does not mean that any drawing will do, but because every line that they would draw would be an act of violence, including or excluding which communities, they were beginning to sort of process those questions for themselves. And we did this throughout as a collaborative process involving the local community organization, activists, students themselves, enough to then conclude the studio on this note. And this is an interesting anecdote when one of my faculty colleagues asked me, is this an urban design studio or is it an urban insert studio? Which are typical paradigms of urban design in the context of architecture education. And I said, it's neither. It's an urban storytelling studio where we are grappling with the histories and futures of colonizing infrastructures on land, in waters, and with winds both unpredictable and certain. And which is to say that this is the start of a long-term investment and engagement with those communities, because we want to sort of, again, go back to that idea of slow archive. if an institution were to begin to engage with these communities, where and what is the form of archive that could take form and shape, not within the four walls of the institution, but somewhere which is not just addressing the question of access and ownership, but it's addressing the question of futures. And so it's an interesting sort of, I thought maybe two examples, one which grapples with the idea of futures, but is largely looking at an existing digital public archive and one's role in engaging with it. And the other where the archive is non-existent, except it's being documented and it's being sort of collected through objects and artifacts more locally. And then through a deep infrastructural study, one is able to build that archive, but also think about the long-term sort of engagement and promise of an institution with the students and with the community. So I'll pause there as a way to sort of open up this question of, yes, liberating the archive, but liberating the archive for whom and to what, in which direction. And because one is sort of thinking or grappling with this idea of futures, I thought histories and futures, that conversation needs to go hand in hand. So I'll pause there for now, but thank you.
Thank you, Kush. This is unbelievable, the way the linkages are sort of flowing from, one to the other. And in fact, Sritama is also, I think, very much on your page asking very similar questions. Sritama Chatterjee is a PhD student in the Department of English, University of Pittsburgh. She's currently working at the intersections of post-colonial studies and environmental humanities, more specifically on the Indian Ocean. As an archival scholar, she is currently thinking through the question, if it is a world which is on the verge of disappearance, right, with climate change and sea levels rising, then how do you archive something which is disappearing? Or what constitutes the archive of the present? So Sritama, over to you to take a stab at your own questions. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Milli Network, and thank you to all my co-colleagues in this panel. And it has been so generative in my thinking about archives and how I can sort of carry this forward in my thinking, in my research, and also in my teaching. So just to give you a context or where I'm coming from or in this presentation today, my presentation for today is not like a formal one, but I'll basically be talking about an exercise that I did with my students at University of Pittsburgh. So I'm a PhD student, but I also happen to teach a class on seminar in composition, topics, and diversity, which is basically a first-year writing class that across disciplines people in University of Pittsburgh need to take. And diversity, because of course they need a brown person to be teaching a class on diversity, because that's just easy and convenient for them. But also, when I came to this class, my intention was, how can I make this class work? I know that I was a token diversity person teaching a class on diversity, but how do I make it work my own way and also make it work for my students? And with this intention, I came into the classroom. And the archives exercise that I did with my students, which I'll share in a bit, was actually part of their research unit. And I will share yes. Yeah, can everybody see it? So this was the class that I was teaching, which was on borders and on border stories, power poetics, and architecture. And the two questions that I had for my students was basically, what is it that digital archives can teach my students about writing, and more specifically about writing about borders? So with this question, I came into the classroom. Now to give you a glimpse of the kind of exercise that they were specifically required to do for this class, I am going to share yet another document. Is it visible? Yes. So this is their part of their research paper, and they basically had 3 tracks. So the first track would be they could write an argumentative research paper. The second track, which is basically what I'm going to talk about today, is the section on digital archives. And the third is a creative critical retelling of one of the primary sources, or many of the primary sources that they were thinking to engage with. And they did have the option of really combining these 2 tracks. For instance, one can really use an archival material to write a historical novel or to write a short story. So those boundaries between genres and how do you do them when you engage students with digital archives and writing were at the forefront of this class. And there were some students who wrote like brilliant short stories about an archival document that they found, and I cannot share this because of FERPA reasons, but the blurring of genres basically did happen when it came to this class. So I will show you my PowerPoint now, which I can't locate. Yes. Right. Yes, so for my presentation for today is titled Writing with an Archive, Argument, Labor, and Narrative. So when we think about the archive, and I've been listening to this conversation that has been going on from the morning about how do we think of the archive not as an object or not as an artifact in itself, but we engage with the co-creation of archive itself. And therefore, I think that one of the ways in which we think of the archive not as an object, but as a method and also engage with it is by if we start thinking of an archive in the process of writing with it, writing along it, alongside it, rather than writing on it or writing about it. And the three arguments, or what I'm going to talk about today, is three aspects of this writing that involves writing with an archive and about an archive, which is argument, labor, and narrative. So slideshow from beginning here. So these are the key questions. What can digital archives teach my students about writing, and more specifically about research writing? What are the potentials and problems of teaching writing using digital archives? And the third question, I'll get to it if I have time for today, which is how do you teach writing about with an archive that doesn't exist at all, right? So before I started teaching this class, what I did first was show them a selection of two archives. One was 1947 Partition Archives, and another was SADA, the South Asian American Digital Archives. And there was, of course, a pre-selected source that I showed them. I showed them a couple of pamphlets of the Ghadar Party and also the anti-colonial organizations that was functional in US in the first decades of the 20th century and also like 19th century. And then I also went through like how, if they are searching for something in the digital archive, what is the mechanism of search that they're adopting, right? Because we often talk about, hey, we found this thing X or Y or Z, but we don't often theorize that how do we reach that search process, or what are the sort of categorizations or organizations or rationales that goes into the thinking of it. So this was the worksheet that I basically circulated in the class, which is like, choose any one of the two digital archives that were shown to you. And within that archive, you have the option of choosing any one or two documents, photographs, objects, and then write down all the information that is already recorded about that artifact, basically making them sensitive to how metadata about an object is created, because it's not just about the object itself, but the technology, the infrastructure, and the kind of labor that has actually gone into the making of that object, or how the object is sort of like classified or categorized within a digital platform itself. The second thing was I asked them to keep a track of the keywords that they were searching for when they were finding the source. And third is when they have finally found their object or something that they were really interested in, then to actually take very detailed, copious notes about the texture of an archive, the contents of the archive, and if it's an audio clip or a video clip, what are the kind of like dynamics that was operating between the interviewer and the interviewee. And finally, if the object that they found in the archive is connected to a sort of broader question that they have about their topic of interest. So this was basically the worksheet that was circulated. And here I would stop sharing to talk about a couple of things. when one goes into the act of writing about the materials that they have found, there are four things that arises. First is, how do you make an argument depending on the sources that you have found? The second being, what is your methodology? And I'm not saying that they can't be interweaved together, they can be interweaved together, but how do you sort of put them in conversation with each other? The third is, so argument, method, the citational practices. And if when you're writing about digital archive, your citational practices change from the way you write about print archives. Because in some ways, citations of digital archives, the space of the digital creates opportunities. For instance, if you are writing about a digital object in the sphere of a digital, let's say a blog, you could literally link it, hyperlink the object. You could also show the image. You could embed in some sort of soundtrack that you have located. So in the form of digital writing about an archival object, there is no linear path. It's often non-linear path. But if we are to read about the same artifact in the form of, say, let's say a print journal, we often have to go in a very linear fashion. So making students sort of aware of this non-linearity of archival objects when you are writing in a digital medium was also like part of the task. The second thing and the second challenge which I was facing, or the students were facing rather, and something I also face as a student myself, is how do you sort of interweave method and narrative? Like, what stories do you tell? And what is the sort of the logic, or what is the sort of rationale on the basis of which you are telling that stories? If it is a community-based archive, and Kush has already spoken a lot about it, and how we need to be like collaborating with communities to come up to engage into this task of knowledge production. And the third being, if one has to create a narrative out of it, I have, especially for digital archives, I have source X, I have source Y, I have source Z. Great. And I could probably use source X, Y, and Z to tell you a story. And the audience might be like really amazed by the kind of storytelling that would come out of connecting X, Y, and Z. But the question is, and this is often a problem that I've seen with undergraduate writing, which is, how do you know what you're telling is really right? Because sources are always fragmented, sources are always volatile. And how do you know how typical that is? Or are you theorizing your own engagement with the process of digital archives itself when you are writing about it? And the third question being, so if you are citing or if you're writing about objects or something that you found in a digital archive, is it just enough to acknowledge, okay, so I have worked with X, Y, and Z archivists and archives, and that's it? Or do you actually make sure that within the research article itself, there is a section where you talk about the labor of the archivists themselves? Like, what are the citational practices that need to change when we are talking about digital archives, right? So these are some of the questions with which I have been trying to think more about. So primarily, I have two things to offer here. A is, if a student is writing about a journal, about an archive in a print forum, there might also be options given to the student to actually have a sort of digital counterpart to it, so that you could some work that might not be done in print medium, digital medium can offer to do that. For instance, actually showing that non-linear circuitous paths that actually led to the engagement of like encounter with the object itself. The second being, and I think this is something that Nonica and Kush both have spoken about, which is, how about if it is an open archive, actually get students to make or co-create the archive in itself, so that they just don't remain as passive consumers. So these are some of the broader theoretical questions that I have in mind. And the final thing that I want to say is that if we are teaching a class on digital archives, and because I am a digital humanities skeptic in many ways, so I have to say this, which is often if you are working with physical archives, by the time you have reached a document, you already have read other documents and you already know the context so much that it's easy for you to tell the story because you know where that object is coming from or where that paper is coming from. But in digital archives, what you're doing is you're basically doing granular searches and you're disaggregating data, one data from another in many ways, unless you're doing like data visualizations and stuff like that. And this disaggregated model of searching often results in fragmented forms of storytelling. And what does that fragmented forms of storytelling mean for our disciplines? History, literary studies, architecture, or whatever, is something that we really need to think very carefully and think really deeply. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sritama. I think what you're speaking of really links back to what TB Dinesh and Janastu have been trying to do, which is the re-narrating the web, right? And I think we're all taking different stabs at solving or addressing or, just about bracing some of these issues. So I think, yeah, we all require this collective group, right, to actually move forward on these answers. If we can take a few questions, we're a little bit over time, but I would like to just sort of not, ignore all the sort of participants talking on YouTube and whatnot. If I can just drop the first question to you, Kush, we'll be quick with this, but, I hope everybody gets to say what they need to. The question was actually about location. You used the word hyper-local. And I think given that digital archives often seem like they're everywhere and nowhere, and this panel is really about who is this for, right? Where do you locate the hyper-local, or would you like to say something about that?
So, hi, that's a great question. So one thing that I may not have been able to explain fully was this studio in the context of Virinium, south of Trivandrum, was looking at infrastructures of access, equity, climate change, economy, and waste. And typically one would think of infrastructures as these large scale networks that don't touch us. But the studio is operating at a scale of palpability. In what ways are these infrastructures being actively inhabited with objects, with lived experiences, with memories, and then how do they translate into the kind of domesticities that these, or micro economies that these communities are able to sort of live with. And so the task of the studio was to begin to document these micro histories at the level of everyday life, but also the level of everyday economy. And so one way to address this question of hyperlocal was not a kind of an imposed understanding of scale or kind of focus, but something which was coming from within the communities themselves that we were collaborating with. And so the only consistent scale that connected to this idea of hyperlocal was palpability. If you can't feel it, then it's not really there. And if you feel it, and if those are the objects and memories and records you're living with, then how can you continue to build an archive that does not lose that scale of palpability, that question of palpability? So here, I mean,
so something like skin in the game.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Right. But the idea is that how not to create archives that are disembodied and completely removed from the lived experiences of the people, because and it's not just about locating the archive in Virinium or in Calicut or with CSCF, which is a local activist organization, but it could have multiple folds. But then each fold needs to really live up to this idea of palpability. Gotcha. And that's the ambition. We'll see to what extent it unfolds.
Okay. Can I just ask Swati the next question? This is from Karan. The question was, during the pedagogy you described, did you also explore discussing with students the way in which questions of citizenship and processes around it work today? So how much of the contemporary entered the classroom,
Yes, very much, because I think we are just coming out in the spring semester. We ended with, in the fall, with the protests that were happening in Delhi. Several of our students participated. And when they were looking at this application, very often they would ask us, but what happened to this person for these 6 years that she was away? Or what about this one stray document, and then we don't see what happened. And I think through that silence of the archive, of that document, through all the all the different silences and the incomplete leads that are there, that really brings us to our own encounters with officialdom and with bureaucracy. So I think it was a way in which students could link this to, and again, going back to the Constituent Assembly debates on citizenship, whether it was going to be the right of soil or the right of blood-based descent, that debate is very much alive now with the recent amendment to the CAA. And the recent amendment seeks to undo the wounds of partition. So I think in that very palpable way, if we look at this document, which is about a woman whose family who experiences partition and crosses the border and tries to cross it back, I think it did bring that debate back into the classroom in a very urgent manner. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think it was a very, very tender time, right, at the time that you were teaching. So I wanted to say, we are mindful of people's attention spans and the need to just take a minute. There are a few questions, and the one that I will cue you for, Nonica, which is a little bit of a debate that was happening on the chat on the side, was about the way in which these living archives are being represented, right? So somebody mentioned, sorry, I'm losing names right now, but somebody mentioned the People's Archive of Rural India. And Padmini sort of also mentioned the fact that this is not actually authored by the people in the archive, right? And I think this is a very contentious question. This is something that, as I said, we're all trying, right? We don't necessarily have the answers. We're all taking a stab at it, but we will return in 5 minutes to perhaps take off with this question and then see how we can perhaps look at other practices that may be trying it differently. So we'll just take a 5-minute break.
Could we take a 10-minute break?
You can totally join in more than that. Maybe I'll plan to show the stuff that I was. Okay, we'll figure this out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So we'll just be back in 5 to let everybody get a cup of tea, water, whatever. And see you in 5. The discussion really is the concluding discussion about the entire week, in fact, right? Which is, what are our takeaways? How do we use this stuff? Is there something we can learn from each other, right, in terms of better ways to do this? And also, of course, just awareness on this amazing repository of like what you guys have created. I think that we require this level of attention and intensive, right, pedagogy to go forward. So please see you in a few. Yeah, thank you. should we resume? I see Aparna Subramaniam has a hand raised, and I'm testing the sheet. Okay. So there is a question, right, which I think is a perfect segue to me, showing off a little bit of work. This is the question that comes from Titus. Sorry, I'm always opening the wrong document. Just one second. Where did the question go? Yeah, sorry, here. Which says basically, do we need to change our academic paradigm, where our training as historians needs to move away from only getting from the archive, right? And now actually building archives. And this is a question by Pratiti. And Pratiti, I think this was Nonica's point, right? Please, Nonica and Kush and Sritama and Swati, just unmute your mics and then it's a much easier flow. And the question really is about the fact that the official, right, the National Archives of India is not the only archive in town. And the fact of the matter is there's a lot that escapes the gaze, right, of the official. So in many ways, building popular and unofficial and contemporary living, right, sort of, what do you say, collections, repositories, and spaces is the goal of this network, and is precisely about broadening the way in which we think and deploy these archives. So I just wanted to share briefly, while people are sort of coming back from break, some of the work that my students have been doing, which has to do with building these kinds of contemporary spaces. And what I will do, sorry, is, just make sure that I'm sharing the right screen here. Yes. Okay. So this is the deal. Students require resources, right? Sritama, just as you mentioned, the way in which your students have been using digital archives, we are all trying to get our students to look across what Swati was mentioning, right? Pamphlets and popular imagery and all of that, for which we require a directory. Now, one of the efforts of Milli, I hope over time, will be to assemble yet more resources in terms of how this looks. In the meantime, the question of identity, right? Often in high school, students are requested or asked to look into their own genealogies. And this in India is extremely contentious often because it comes with a lot of privilege in terms of who gets narrated, right? If you look at the Pandas at Haridwar or Banaras keeping family genealogical records, right? It is for certain castes. So obviously this is not an uncomplicated question. However, that being said, there is also the sort of presumption of community when you're looking at sort of cultural preservation, right? So these students put together essentially it's an ongoing thing, which is looking at community cookbooks across India. And of course, it's done by language, it's done by all kinds of things. What I'm really interested in also showing you really is the use of tools, right? Now we're talking about building, and I think the work of digital humanities really helps build work in great ways. Digital tools have allowed for us to put things together in a way that wasn't previously possible. So in terms of even integrating audio visual, different languages, right? These tools, I think, are now helping us talk across the unofficial, right? In terms of different registers. And I think, it's only appropriate that we build with our students in terms of telling their stories. This was also an effort coming out of a class I taught where students were looking at why they never got to read about sort of Indian themes and stories growing up, right? Especially English-speaking Indians tend to kind of look at Enid Blyton and such. So in terms of doing that, they really had to put together a database of authors, of publishers, in order to look at what exists, right, by way of Indian themes and stories. So this is all by way of building. And I really hope that what we're talking about unleashes more energy on that front. So that was my very quick 2-second pitch, I hope, of what this is. And really the question about can we stop taking, but also start creating, if you can take a stab at this. So this would be for, all the participants. Kush, you're clearly already building. So can you talk a little bit more about your plans or? You're on mute, sorry.
I was just typing, the idea of pedagogy of the digitally oppressed. I mean, that's one formation, which is looking at how, in what ways might we build. In my case, it's a transnational solidarity. It's a transnational collaborative effort, which is very intentional about our queer feminist anti-colonial positionalities, but also very sort of open and acknowledging of our own privileges, whether it's my Savarna privilege or whether it's Ashley Caranto's sort of settler colonial privilege or Arun Jacobs' settler colonial privilege in colonially called Canada. And so I think we start and grapple with those questions. And this goes back to one of the questions I think was in the thread as to how do you not just build, but how do you then build with students, or how do you build with communities? What does that process look like? And I think it's a slow process to begin with, but it's also a process which has to be honest enough to be able to name your complicities in structures that are depriving and or disenfranchising certain communities who are much more vulnerable and or have historically been ignored and or sort of been at the receiving end of injustices. But then on the other hand, also then sort of understand where to then seed the floor and really listen enough to be able to build an archive, not for you or not for an institution or not to serve a particular agenda or purpose, but to sort of think about its formation as impacting whether it's policy or capacity building or community organizing. And so I think we need to be much more mindful of the publics of these archives beyond the conventional scholarly public, and who are the different publics, what are the different publics, and then which are the different venues and vehicles to get to those publics, to bring those publics in, to work with those publics.
Yeah.
Nonica, would you like to add to that?
I think Kush has already addressed this point, but I just wanted to reiterate the earlier point that I made, which was that unless and until we dilute that paradigm, archival paradigm itself, right, the co-creation of, or the creation of an alternative archive might just reproduce or reinforce the earlier paradigm. So we just need to be a little more sort of skeptical of these archival projects,
right,
as was addressed by the earlier speaker. So the principle of archiving, which is so embedded and which is a violent principle, first needs to be demythologized. First, we need to unpack, critique, and dismantle it. Absolutely. And I think then once we've done that, we've not done that yet, by the way, because the historian, archive, and the state nexus is very strong.
Right.
So unless we come to grips with that and we critique that and we dismantle it, we dilute it, by making, the common person access the archive in a way the historian might also, to kind of, make the archive transparent, accessible, for multiple uses, not just for an academic history, right?
Absolutely.
For rights, genealogies, family histories, whatever, making it accessible, right? And to kind of come out of this intimidating kind of a syndrome that the archive is a physical and an ideological construct, it's oppressive, and let's critique that. So once we come out of that equation, then obviously there'll be very rewarding possibilities. And then the student, instead of just co-creating that archive, might just then access an archive of a lay person, right? And then, give it a kind of visibility. I mean, it's not just that the student becomes the custodian of knowledge, but student actually comes in a way in which she opens a conversation with people, and to then come up with something very creative and innovative and critical. So it's a shared space. Let's think of it as a shared, inclusive space. Yes. And I think, I have some examples, but maybe I'll come back later.
Yeah. Padmini, so actually there's some activity going on my chat. This is meant to be the breakout session, right? So this is where everybody jumps into the conversation. I know Padmini has something to say. Padmini, if you can unmute yourself, and after her, Rochelle. And it's to do, Nonica, with what you've just been talking about. And then we can pick up the Pari question also later. Yeah? Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Hi. Thanks very much, though. I mean, that was a very inspiring session and some amazing work being done there. Okay.
Yes.
So my question, so I think as I said, that I think, of course, I think we now acknowledge that there is a nexus between the state and the historian, and kind of the archive as paradigm is very restrictive. But I think this idea that we're opening up the archive by then getting, and as Kush was saying, getting students who are in a privileged position to work with, within quotes, a community to create their archive is still a perpetuation of that same sort of archival paradigm, right? So if you are, so say you are somebody who is non-dominant caste, and your history, your archive is one of exploitative violence or of being exploited, the kind of choice to remember that should be in the hands of the community, right? Because that, that remembrance, that memory itself is one of violence and is one of trauma. So I think, and I think Nirmala made a good point in the chat as well about and of course Dinesh's work explicates this, that how you narrate and the positionality of that narration really is what will shape the kind of, the archive, and kind of making it less kind of embedded and less inchoate. So I think that there also needs to be in this notion, absolutely, Nonica, as you're saying, of transparency and enlarging or exploding this paradigm. There also has to be the notion that the way we think about history as embedded in the archive is still a very Enlightenment, very colonial idea. So maybe some people don't want their history to be shaped by that idea of time, for example. And I think Heather, for example, speaks a lot about how Aboriginal communities think about time, right? And how their notion of time is not chronological history or temporal history. So and you yourself said very rightly about Komal Kothari, like the gaps that are there. So I think in the notion of archival design, this idea that it can be designed along the lines of different knowledge systems, so it's at like slightly meta level, I think is something that we need to be maybe thinking a little bit more about. And I just want to quickly address something Sritama was saying about digital humanities and skepticism. I think one thing that I do want to respond with is that, and I think Swati might back me up here, is that like digital humanities, kind of the way that we look at corpus or at an archive is in this exploded view. Like, so, Moretti's very famous framing of distant reading is only possible because we're thinking of it as a network. We're not thinking of it as, search and find. And there are relationships that the edges and the nodes of that network kind of demonstrate, which is what digital humanities is embedded in. I think there is a slight danger of conflating the way we experience the digital, and I've spoken about this in the context of interface design, is obviously shaped very much by corporate paradigms, right? Like, so Google has hierarchical search, which obviously kind of pushes us in a certain direction of accessing knowledge. But I wouldn't say that that is the way that DH kind of looks at the way that we, look at a text or a corpus. And the reason why I gestured to Swati is that Ivanhoe is a very good example of this and is, kind of one of the founding texts of DH work. So yeah, so I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Padmini. Can I go on to Rochelle? Just will be speedy, right? Then Rochelle, you're on. Can I also introduce Rochelle as somebody who, I think a decade ago, when there really was not even the tools, honestly, to put this together, started trying to database archives and libraries across India. And I think that they really ran into all kinds of trouble precisely because there was not such a robust ecosystem as there is now. So we really look forward, Rochelle, to Archives and Access Take 2, right, in the coming decade. Thanks.
Hopefully it will have a take 2, Maya. Thanks. And I've really enjoyed listening to this. Actually, just to respond to, hi Swati, just to respond to Nonica, the curious thing is it's actually history departments in India have had the least, or they've left, the tiniest trace possible about this entire process that I think Sritama was talking about, the whole question of how do we access something, what are its difficulties? And it's actually been maybe digital humanities that has unpacked some of it. But the other aspect that I think Nonica has touched on is this question of, if you actually are talking to archivists, often the authorities right at the top are quite open. And then, but in fact, the staff all the way up to the top are actually extremely anxious about this idea of a public, right? So it's this abstract citizen that seems to generate the most anxiety in the archive. And as Nonica was saying, it's, I think actually when you find mundane users of the archive, that's one way to unpack this model, where she says you have this model of the political archive and the state. And I realized that when you're working in conventional state archives, I realized that there were like hundreds of people walking in to just access land documents, right? And at that point, the archive just behaves like some municipal office. It's like, okay, you want this document here, it's microfilmed, you pay a price and you get it, right? Whereas when I walk in as a scholar, immediately there's an entirely different set of issues that comes into place, even though I could be looking for exactly the same document. So I think it's this question of, if you just keep taking different kinds of citizens to the archive where the demands are extremely mundane, that begins to be one way to access the state, where it just starts behaving like a sort of local ward office, and it begins to it obviously doesn't address the issues that somebody who's working on a border territory, and all of those issues I know remain in place. But one way to unpack it is, I think, just to create more consumers in a way for state documents.
Yeah. Aparna Subramaniam, I think you've had your hand up for a while. So can I ask you to unmute yourself?
Yeah. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So I've been attending the sessions throughout the, okay, the video too. Okay. I have been attending the sessions throughout the week, across 2-3 organizers in India, though I'm located in the US right now. A lot of focus seems to be, on the applications of archiving, including digital humanities, which we've been talking about. And I was lucky that at least there was one technical component of data management one of the days. So, being from a technical background, I would say that we are limiting ourselves, with just education related to application of archives from a digital humanities, historical or literary point of view. Education for students also need to focus on how archives function rather than just being merely users of that space. So more than even building or creating new archives, which was just spoken about a while ago, what about maintenance of the archive? Like, who are going to be the people who will run the archive in the future?
Absolutely.
So archival education, I think, lacks a holistic approach where, training related to processes of operations in the archive, including technical expertise for digital restoration, data management, and of course, preservation, conservation, which involves, chemistry to some extent, is, completely lacking. And I mean, I just find it, from someone coming from a, a film archive or an audiovisual archive background, I just find this like we are actually going ahead a leap in, applications of archiving than focusing on, the basic aspects itself. That's like, I mean, since today is a student session, I'm just, speaking, for this as a mid-career, professional who quit, work to study moving image archiving in the US right now. So I just kind of believe that, we need to focus on a holistic approach towards even maintaining archives.
Got you. Absolutely vital point. I hope, Swati, you will join me next in terms of the fact that we really encourage our students, right, to right now consider careers in information science, library, right? These fields have been revolutionized, right, by the fact that we're an information society. These are critical and vital trainings, right, that you're talking about. So thank you, Aparna. I think Swati wanted to say something. Swati, if you can unmute yourself.
Yes, and this is taking on again the provocation that Nonica sort of left us with, and you sort of kept pushing us in that direction of we need to dismantle the archive as it is now. I think also the point that Rochelle just made, and this is carrying over from yesterday when we were talking about archives of border regions. So I don't know. I mean, this is something I'm struggling with myself, because on the one hand, with right to information, for example, or with this idea of a citizen should have access to the information that the state is producing about us, and that has very tangible daily consequences on our lives, and that we should be able to go and access that information, whether it is in the department that I access through an RTI query, or if it's housed in an archive, I should be able to go in the archive. And when the state denies that information, and again, I was giving this example yesterday of from my own work, in the Tibetan cultural region. And I mean, Sikkim used to be a relatively non-controversial border state, and documents about Sikkim, at least till 2015, 16, they're relatively easy to access, you know, even about Ladakh.
Right.
If it's not in the Kashmir section, it's relatively easy. And then post Doklam, all of that, again, you know, those documents went out of circulation, the maps went out of circulation. So I understand the imperative to create new archives and to give voices to people who are absent or silenced or misrepresented in the archives. But I also feel, perhaps as a historian, and maybe, you know, I still haven't completely decolonized my own praxis, but there are these repositories of information about us, again, that have consequences on our lives. And how do we make those accessible? How do we make those processes? I mean, for example, in the National Archives, if you want to look at a map, you cannot even, I mean, at least my last visit in October, you can't even take your laptop to the map room. You have to take a physical, like, pencil and paper. You can't photograph the map. You can't photocopy the map. They discourage you from drawing the map. You know, so it's, you can go and see it and you can take your notes on it. So, I mean, just that, like, this is what one is faced with, you know, when one is trying to tell the histories of the border regions. And I'm aware that they can be told in many different ways and through many different sources.
Yeah.
But these sources have the ones that lie on the other side of the gate, and with their many gatekeepers, are also very consequential. And I think that battle also needs to be fought to make them more accessible.
Right.
Yeah.
Swati, you'll appreciate the thought, right? That I think the sentiment is to say that official archives are tools of governance, right? And those paper truths make identities and those contests, right, validated in certain ways and disallow others. Now, this is the historian struggle, right? Is there a correct answer finally, right? Or are they just narratives that are sort of flowing out? In terms of governance, often we know in terms of ethically what correct answer we want, right? And we are sort of demanding those paper truths to perhaps arrive at our doorstep. But I think I think it's Malini as well as Titus and Nirmala, there are these conversations on the chat box, right? Basically saying, and Nirmala says this, it's important to understand the caste class underpinnings that inform, right, these record-making practices. So I'm absolutely with you that, and I think Rochelle's effort, you know, since a decade plus, was very much about the repatriation model. At least can we access what already exists officially, whether it's been used for, you know, all kinds of colonizing and governance activities or otherwise, but can we look at them, right, at the very least? And it's really beautifully said by, again, Nirmala, which was that on the one hand, you're dismantling, right? And on the other hand, you're recreating. And they're sort of going together to create this moment, which I think we believe is possible, right? This is the thing. I think our classrooms are our crucibles for, in a sense, empowering and training a future generation of people to think differently, right? We, I think, are still recovering. As you said, we're far from being decolonized. Yeah. But the very fact that these students can make, and Sritama, I think you're also in that sense very much in the critical side of things, right? As far as saying that I don't accept the way things have been. I want it to, you know what I'm saying, be rebuilt or looked at. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that one of the very micro ways in which we can get students thinking and engaging with the archival process or creation itself is there are many existing archives which need often like students to transcribe something that already exists, right? And so, for instance, just after my research unit, one of the units that we had in my class was public writing. And this forms of engaging the public, or what is the public here that Kush earlier pointed out, can take many forms, right? So I think one of the small ways, like little ways in which one could actually co-create in the participation of their archives is actually through transcribing. That's something very basic, that's something very simple, but it could be totally done. The second thing I think Nonica had also spoken earlier about, we have to challenge this paradigm of the archive or archival experience itself and sort of demystify it. And I'm trying to think of the relationship between the field and the archive here. Like, archive is where you are, right? In many ways. If you are traveling in a train and you see someone like singing a song, that becomes a living archive in itself. So I think we also need to carefully think about this question of the field and the archive. And the third thing, I think what Parna Subramaniam just pointed out about how the maintenance of archive itself is itself a huge question. I'm thinking of my experience in a state university in India, and how funding has been such a huge challenge, because to ensure that archival documents are in a sustained and maintainable state, you need temperature, you need things to actually make sure that the digitization happens, right?
This is interesting because we did have a panel on preservation and all of that, and that was actually disputed. The idea that you require air conditioning and all of this as your preset, so this is again a perception thing, right? I mean,
yeah. So again, we have to think about this funding structures, because unless we are questioning funding structures of private bodies or public institutions, it's very hard to be even like answering these questions. But it's an important question that we really need to be thinking about. How do we even like sustain it, or how do we even manage it?
Like to add again that we are actually jumping a leap ahead, talking about usage of archives to some extent. Maintaining the archive, I necessarily am not speaking from the perspective of, temperature control or the environmental controls. We need education in India, even distinguish between the different, aspects within archiving in the first place. You have preservation, you have conservation, you have digitization, then you have restoration, then it comes to the question of access. So if your documents are not preserved properly in the first place, access is just a luxury for you. And the fact that like even in terms of preservation or conservation, the fact that all the national archives lack trained staff. So where do the national archives or the institutions currently go and look for trained professionals if we don't have education in this domain at all?
Right. Actually, we have in our audience somebody who used to work at the National Archives, and I understand that he has been
I personally have carried out my previous research at National Film Archive of India 2 years ago.
Pune,
and I am from Pune basically. So the question is, I'm sure a lot of people here are from literary background or film studies background as well. All of us know to go and use the archives. Nobody ever bothers the struggles they go through to maintain those documents, or undergoing staff crunches they have because they also lack training.
Absolutely.
So in the Indian system, we lack the entire, the pedagogy of education itself in archival context needs to change.
It does need to change. I think you're absolutely right. We wanted this panel to also reflect student voices. Thank you, Aparna. And we have Aparna Vedic. Can you join me in calling on some students? Sorry, I'm not familiar with names right in this audience. So I think you said Ritvik Mishra, Vandita, Pratiti. We'd like to hear some talk back from, the people that we're supposed to be guiding, and we don't often have the wisdom, right, in terms of guiding you through this new digital age. But Aparna, would you like to just unmute and call on?
Yeah, hi. There was a question from Ritvik Mishra who said he has just started his work. There is one that the ones I can recognize. There might be.
I understand.
Yeah. So Vandita, Pratiti, Vasif, Paridhi, Shrija, Shivangi. These are some of our students who have joined in, and let's hear them. Let's hear what they have to say.
You might want to call, on a specific, or because they'll have to be unmuted and such, no?
Okay. Ritvik and Vandita have been made co-hosts.
Okay. So Ritvik, maybe?
And Vandita has experience working with the Partition Archive. And Pratiti has worked with children's literature.
Mm-hmm.
Shrija has worked with photographs. So, all of them. And Shivangi's worked with maps and the archives. And Vasif is working on oral histories of the Bakarwals. And yeah, so please feel free to come in and ask questions and tell us how we could do this differently. What are your thoughts about the archives? Go ahead, Shivangi.
Thank you, Pranav, for mentioning. So the one question that I have is, Professor Datta mentioned about diluting the present paradigm, right? But how do you, I mean, and working with the state to sort of dilute the present paradigm. But how do you work around states or situations where, let's say, like currently the BJP is trying to actively rewrite histories, right? We also, recently we came across the news of Boris Johnson asking for ruining the colonial archives. So how, in such a situation, how do we go around, let's say, diluting it, or how do you work with the state that does not see eye to eye with, let's say, a historian who's trying to write histories that don't align with the nationalist agenda?
I think she's on mute. Shivangi.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think, Shivangi, thank you for raising this point. Somebody on the YouTube chat actually raised a very similar point. This is Kuldeep Garg who said, and he was talking to Nonica's point, which is, what is the relevance of democratization of archives if our lived experiences are themselves undemocratic, right? And it's a very, very powerful statement. So I don't know who to ask to jump in to speak on this, but Aparna, with your recent book on lynching, I think actually you're the person to really talk to this.
Thanks for putting me on a spot when I'm trying to manage your YouTube, the background questions, and your...
Yeah. Just this point, yeah.
Okay, I need to hear the question again. Can you rephrase it for me, Maya?
I'll just read it verbatim. Actually, this is from the YouTube chat. What is the relevance of democratization of archives if our lived experiences are themselves undemocratic? Is there an archival correction that can, in a sense, you know what I'm saying, do something different, right? Because our lived experiences are not these ideal spaces, is there something else that can be changed with regards to the record, or do we read it differently? Do we re-narrate, as Dinesh says?
I'm just trying to think, because I know democracy is valuable as a political process, but my classrooms are not always the most democratic.
Okay. Nonica has her hand raised, which is unusual.
Okay, Nonica, go ahead with it.
Nonica, take it, please. Yeah.
Swati, Kush, do you want to go for this?
There might be other people who would like to say.
You can just briefly say your piece and then we'll move. Yeah.
No, I was referring to the student who was asking me that question.
Yes, very similar. Yeah.
So, I mean, my point was not about a political party hijacking, any political party hijacking a particular historical agenda. My point was larger than that. It was about the state, history, and the archive. That paradigm we've not been able to come out of. So that's a clarification.
Got you. Absolutely. Thank you. Kush, Swati.
One thought that comes to mind is this sort of the reality of publics and counter-publics, right? I mean, that's part of a democracy. And so moment you think through this question of what does it mean to create archives when your lives are themselves not fully democratic, if one were to sort of filter it through this idea of counter-publics have existed and will continue to exist, then it raises the question of then what is the archive of the counter-public? And each counterpublic can then begin to sort of determine whether or not an archive with a capital A or archive with a lowercase a can exist, and within whom and for how long. Sometimes, we in these temporalities, we forget that the archives need not be for perpetuity. I mean, in terms of it can have an end date. It can address a purpose to sort of again address this question of creating more openings for voices and democracies to thrive. But then it can also self-silence themselves and/or take another form that continues this project of democracy alive, but from within, and this idea of this different hybrid forms that need not always be visible in the conventional archival colonial.
And don't cancel each other out, right? This is the other silliness of, I think, I think Wasif had his hand raised. Wasif, are you okay to unmute?
Yeah. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
So yeah, basically I am a history. I'm a history student, and I'm doing my research on the Gujars and the Bakarwals, the nomadic communities in Jammu and Kashmir. And going through all of these sessions, I have been part of a few, and I was thinking about how the archive is coming up again and again when we talk about history writing, so as to say, how it's very essential when we think about writing history. And when we think about the archive as such, that what it is actually, like for example, the National Archives, for example, it's just like a collection of documents, so as to say. And how do those documents and how do those collections become so central to our understanding of the past? I guess that is what has been taken up especially by, for example, by Professor Nonica also, that, when we talk about history writing, it usually would go back to a sort of a place that is an archive and how it becomes so central. But like when you think about the archive, it doesn't really has to be that, like that central piece that, that's something you have to create, dismantle, unpack, or, refigure in a way, like creation of the community archive, for example. And in that session also, I felt that there was this tension between us and them. Then you create that binary, which I guess is not very conducive if I think about it. So this countering, dismantling, it all points to all points back to the point that archive becomes central. And why is it that? Why is the conversation around that? And given that I am coming from a historical perspective, like how history is being written in particular.
Yeah. Pratiti, does your point dovetail with this? If you can unmute yourself.
I have a question, which is again about the idea of a democratic archive. And my question is about form of an archive.
Yes.
Like why is an archive, like sort of the National Archive, is a more legitimate archive than something that we digitize more? So, for example, there are certain things that you can only find out by someone's Instagram page. And that is also a sort of an archive that they are making. And why do we, why is our instinct, but we can never cite that in a paper that we write. And this is a very big dilemma I have, because if we want to make the knowledge, or if we want to make it accessible, if we want it to be, if we want it to live, then it cannot live in a dark room. Like, it has to live in the world. But then that again, in our in academia, then we don't accept it. Then that's a dilemma. I also have a question. This is a burning question about the partition archive and the partition archiving that has happened. And I don't know, but the Bengal archiving is very different from how it's been archived in the West. And maybe the Bengal experience is more complicated, but is there a paradigm that we have now come into with the partition archiving that we cannot move? Do we need to move away from that to maybe archive other kinds of partition experiences that are not about the sharp break, that are not about loss, that are different in, like, the whole Bengal experience is more complicated. That's just why I feel that this is a paradigm we need to move away.
Yeah. No, Pratiti, thank you. That is amazing because it's really become a trope, right? And I totally see what you're saying. I wanted to say in terms of the emphasis on the state, right? Clearly, this cannot be the only source of history. Clearly, even when there's a ruling party, there are other parties who have, other things going on. Your generation, more than anyone, has understood that so much is being auto-archived in the digital, right? So I know that one of my students did a thesis on sort of body shaming on Instagram, right? And so there are other topics also that are coming out of these auto archives that are being generated. And the whole idea is to multiply these voices. So I totally get your point that let's not be stuck in one version of, the trope taking this has made. Sorry, there was somebody after Pratiti.
Sorry, if I can just add, Maya, some of it also has to do with disciplinary gatekeeping, right?
Yeah.
So if only 10 archives were the repositories of legitimate information, then only 50 scholars who had access to those 10 archives would be legitimate scholars.
Yes.
So some of it is that, but I think just to your point, and those were excellent questions, we need to bring the same kind of reflective analytical rigor to reading an Instagram post as we do to reading an archival document. So I think, I mean, that's where, again, as a teacher, of course, cite Instagram, cite Facebook posts, but read them rigorously as well. And I think it's because of the way, the context within which certain sources have come to us, we sort of tend to bring that rigor to our reading of some sources and not others because, they're in our context, we inhabit them, or an RWA circular or WhatsApp chat. So I think if we can do that, think of all of these as texts that then be subject to analysis, then by all means cite them.
Absolutely. Vandita, you wanted to come in on that, sorry?
Yes, Professor. I just wanted to ask about, the fact that at least at Ashoka, and I'm sure even at Flame and at Jindal, we're exposed to archival material pretty early on in our undergraduate career. But I think what I've seen across the sessions is that, we're not involved in creating the archive. And so often we don't experience the problems of what goes into creating an archive, the biases that are there, the problems of what does not go into the archive and how that is chosen. So is there a way to, involve undergraduate students in, in some sort of archive creation?
Yes.
So that they experience the challenges firsthand and, maybe not overcome them, but at least they're aware of those challenges that are there, not only in that micro archive that they may be creating, but in the larger archives that we believe to be quote unquote legitimate archives.
Yeah. Vandita, I think this is exactly what Arundhati Subramaniam was referring to. Venkat, I'm going to put you on the spot now and actually thank you for offering students the opportunity to understand what the mechanics of the archives are, right? And this is literally through spending time there. We're really hoping, Venkat.
Hi.
Yeah.
Sorry, I could not, there was some glitch, so I could not figure out the raise hand option.
Yeah. Go for it, Ritvika. Yeah.
Yeah, and my bandwidth is slow, so I'm not opening the video. So the thing is, I have been working in an archive. I'm based out of Calcutta, which is a public institution, but the archive, the visual archives, it works mostly out of donations from private collections and few with collaborations of other institutions like galleries and spaces where we basically digitize the collection, have a MOU and contract and everything, and it's open mostly to research scholars to access the materials. Now, being myself a history student and a researcher at this point of time, now my research entails in looking into these micro personal private collections in and around Bengal. What I really found while doing this, you really don't have any such comprehensive archive. So my training as a historian was at best till my graduation was to deal with the state archives and the conventional government places. But this the doctoral practice has made me to build my own archives as I go about researching, because most of the archives, be it oral interviews, audio recordings, or even pictures that I'm taking along, is being formulated into one holistic kind of archive, and which I am kind of open to share it with people who are interested.
Absolutely. Ritvika, can I just tell you that the whole Access and Archives movement was the early version of mirroring a lot of what doctoral scholars were doing. So several PhD scholars would anyway end up hitting up some archive or some space and accessing records, which instead of sitting there, right, access an archive as collections. So you're totally, I mean, spot on in terms of identifying that audience.
But while doing so, the larger question which I have to all of you, and because it's a closing session more so, is while doing so, there are a lot of these, individuals who are collecting something, maybe ephemera or posters out of their own volition.
Right.
They don't have any knowledge of archiving, nor they have any idea of like the standards of archiving that has been maintained. They are basically photographing them or scanning them, and it's up in their computer or laptops. Now, there are few of such individuals who have a blog in place. Like I had mentioned in the chat, but I'll repeat it again here for everyone. Is there is this blog in which is run by 2-3 people. It's a collaboration who archives all the Soviet books that were published and translated into Bengali, and that's an excellent initiative. But sadly, it's So I can see Sritama as like aware of it. But the thing is, like, these are very kind of micro initiatives by 2-3 people or group of individuals, and the resource as a whole is actually of really great importance. But in the ambit of professional archives or formal institutional archives, they do not have any kind of presence, and people also don't know about these. So how do you think one can envisage to bring all of these, personal initiatives? Maybe they don't follow the protocols of being a standardized archive, but to bring them into the larger ambit where people also can have an access to it, and it can be brought under the regularized practices of archive.
Yeah, and the metadata, I think practices also, if they're more homogenized, would help what we're calling it interoperability and such. Sorry, there was somebody, Shrija? Shrija, did you want to speak your question out? Okay, I'll just go for articulating on her behalf. While working with archival sources, how can we be better trained to interpret silences and gaps? I hope I have not silenced you, Shrija. Okay.
Unmute her.
You've unmuted her, no? Sorry.
I think she is co-host now. Yes.
Hello.
Yes. Hi, Shrija.
Go for it, Shrija. Thank you. I would not like to
sorry,
silence.
everyone. There was some sort of confusion with the unmuting part. I was just trying to ask that. So I've written the question out in the chat. I was wondering how we can be better trained as students of history who want to read archival sources and use them in our research to interpret silences and gaps as information, and not just looking at them as silences, but also interpreting that absence as information too. So, for example, in the case of sensitive histories, especially Professor Swati mentioned in partition histories, how can we look at them as, for example, there are testimonies from personal private testimonies from men about how the women in their families what the experiences of the women in their families during the partition, except the voices of the women they're not coming from the women themselves. So how do we treat that absence, and how do we interpret it as not just absence but information itself?
Okay. Venkat, can I ask you to also address this question, because you have painstakingly also been part of building something, and I'm sure a lot was left out, not often deliberately, but...
Sorry, like Aparna, you put me in a spot. I'm like frantically trying to push questions into your moderator window. Can you sort of...
Yes.
I was thinking I was responding to something else earlier. Sorry, what's your question again?
Sorry, about silences in the archive. This is the question that Shrija put in the box.
Okay. Sorry, Shrija. I don't have a good answer to that. I mean, I think the only thing I can say is that I guess to a large degree, if an archive is conscious of its bias, I think that's the best it can possibly do. I mean, this is not to erase any kind of points of view, or the age-old conversation about objectivity, which we'll not touch upon here and such, but just to be sort of conscious about what the archive is representing. So there are 4 or 5 questions that we ask when we are trying to build the archive, and they go as follows. They ask, who is the archive for? Who is the archivist? Who is describing the archive? Who is funding the archive? And are the people being described in the archive part of the archive in terms of visiting it or interrogating it? If we keep asking these questions, I think we will get to a more messy, nuanced version of the archive to some degree. I'm not saying that we'll have answers to it, but at least if we keep asking these questions, perhaps we'll probably get there. There's just one thing maybe I wanted to add to, there was a comment about places of knowledge production. So, we look at something like Instagram, and there is no denying that there are various locations where you can get material. The only addition I'd like to make it is, we do use the word archive in a much more liberal way today than we perhaps did 100 years ago, and which is perfectly fine. It's just useful to see if we can find ways of describing, contextualizing these sites of knowledge production. So if we are able to find a way in which there is, you can call it metadata, you can call it semantic web, you can call it a hashtag. It doesn't, the point is eventually it has to feed back to some way in which people can look at it, revisit it, and find ways of pushing it into their own narratives and structures. My concern is the conflation of an archive and a narrative. Realizing fully well that, as I keep saying, archives come from narratives and archives give narratives. That's all. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, but this is, Venkat, I have you on the spot, so I'm going to hold on for a second. Vishal wrote, right, we do not have any dedicated programs or courses in archival learning education. What can be done, right? How does one get into this? How does one approach Milli or anyone else to skilling up?
Again, I'm speaking to a group of teachers here. So, I'm really not in a position to talk about, teaching students. Like, you guys are in a much better position to do this. The National Archives, of course, runs a course. And I think if Mr. Rajmani is still on the call, he can sort of talk about that.
Right.
There are a few other courses in the country. As far as the consortium goes, this is something that we'd be very interested in doing. We should try and figure out ways in which different kinds of people engage in using the archive or building the archive. I know there are a lot of courses in the country which talk about archival methods, which are largely around using the archive for, some sort of historical knowledge production to some degree. I think we need a lot more conversation around the politics of building the archive. We don't have enough conversation around the theory of the archive. And I think this is something that Aparna had brought about earlier in the conversation. So we can do that. There's no reason why we can't have a monthly reading session, if nothing else. And this is just small little ideas.
Absolutely, yeah. Bindu also mentioned something in our conversation that was absent, saying that I noticed an absence of film archives in these conversations. So she says, while film as an archival material might have come up, I wonder whether the insights of film and media theory have come up. So maybe this can also be tacked on to our reading group plans.
Yeah.
Maya,
could I...
Yes. Rochelle, please go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say, it's one, Jadavpur also, for instance, regularly trains people, right? Students and any interested people to actually learn how to digitize and things. But the other issue is also that we have very few fora where you have library science people, archivists, historians, and students actually sitting at the table. So when I was teaching, I'd actually, taken groups of students to the National Archives, and it turned out to be, quite positive experience. But the other question is, library science keeps developing, and just sitting around, we also held workshops where we tried to get archivists and library science people to kind of, come together. And those are kind of very unusual conversations that rarely happen. This conversation is an example of that. But if there were more such interactions, I think it would go a long way towards, just beginning to dismantle some of the issues that have come up here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Aparna, you want to say something?
I think it was Swati, and I think Paridhi has been waiting to say something. So
okay, please go for it. Yeah.
Paridhi, do you want to go for it first?
Well, I don't have much to say. I'm a student of history, and I've been. I'm sorry I missed a couple of these lectures, but today's was a very enlightening session. And so I've had some experiences of working in the regional archives and state archives, also the National Archives for my PhD. And I was fortunate enough to also work and intern for around a year in the Ashoka archives. And for the students who are now curious and interested in the art of archiving and learning archives, I think Ashoka gives you a very good experience, because there are people who have come from government services, and these are the people who are now taking care of the archive. So the whole process of learning step-by-step archiving is something that you can learn here firsthand. And my experience of working in the Ashoka archive actually helped me a lot work in regional archives, and also a very special kind of archive that was located around my research work in Vrindavan. So a lot of my archives are actually based on temples. And one understands that temple archives also come from a very hegemonic idea of discourse and learning, and they aren't very open with giving out archives to scholars. So there is a restriction there, but how do you sail through and sort of swift yourself through your own agendas through working those archives? So one of the interesting things that I was able to do was to be able to ask a couple of archivists, your archives are not handled and your archives are not digitized and kept in a catalog. May I do it for you? And that was something that really helped, because in Vrindavan, a lot of family archives are not cataloged at all. So this experience of learning proper archive was something that helped me as a researcher in being able to help people archive their own family histories and genealogies, and be able to work in a place that has very traditional archives, which they also considered an object of sanctity. And that kind, I think, if I was lucky enough, but if other scholars and other students are able to get an opportunity like that from their own institutions or institutions otherwise, it really, really helps. Because then while you are working in regional archives or archives that are not cataloged at all, or family archives, you know how to handle them, because there's a question of sanctity. There's also a question of you accessing these archives as scholars for your own interests, and how do you bring these two different modes of life together. So I think Ashoka helped me a lot in that, and I believe that other students, all of us, get some of the other opportunities like that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Paridhi. Thank you. Can I, Kush, I'm going to call on you for this. Okay. Now, see, us who work in universities understand that in some sense we're accreditation agencies, right? That's our job. We say this is proper, this is good, this is official, this is correct. And in another sense, we're also sort of trying to complicate that story, right? So I want to mess with that word proper, which is the idea. I absolutely appreciate Aparna Balasubramaniam's point about the need for good training, Rochelle's point about the need for real coming together of different energies, right, to make it real. But at the end of the day, I think we are also trying to tell stories in very different directions. So Kush, if I can ask you to sort of talk about your experience, especially in the design school, where often we talk about this design thinking model, right? Which is look at the, what are you trying to address question in terms of how you're narrating that solution, and talk about perhaps, is there really a way, or, you know, how do we kind of, without losing rigor, talk about the multiplicity of methods by which we can approach the archives?
Wow, you know, those are big questions, Maya. And, you know, it's something that we've been grappling with. So, you know, having been trained in both the practice, but also the scholarship of architecture and urbanism as a theorist, as a historian, I think it's you know, institutions in some ways have a way of flattening, you know, the kinds of impulses or interests that you come with, and the kind of counter narratives that we may want to produce. And so I think it's a I don't know how to answer that except saying that
I know why I asked you to sort of address this, and it's because perhaps there's a sort of a dual or whatever, multiple platforms on which different things exist. And I was thinking of your offer, right, to do a zine workshop, right? Now the zine is exactly not that official sanction space, but it's a space, and it has its own kind of, you know, place in the world as a place of memory and telling.
Yeah. So what has helped, I can tell you from my own lived experience, what has helped me, or what sort of keeps me going despite all of these institutional protocols and challenges and structures, is being part of collectives that allow me to sort of have a life within the institution, but also not dependent on that institution to do the work that needs to be done. And I think if more of us are able to sort of have or find those collectives, then there are these network possibilities that are not contingent on an official sanctioning from that institution. But the more of that work that you do also opens up that institution to the possibilities that you're offering, whilst you're sort of navigating the everyday rigmaroles of that institution. I don't know if that makes sense. So for example, when I'm thinking through this Urban Humanities Studio, it was not a given. It was something that I started with, and it had its own critics saying that in an architecture school, where is the design? I mean, so one had to do the translation work that even for students, 2/3 into the semester, I said, are you able to sort of grapple with the scales of the studio? It's not your conventional architecture studio where you start with a design project and you end with it, but rather here we're sort of grappling with your own agency as critical spatial thinkers and thinking of architecture as part of a larger collaborative process of world making. And then if you position yourself in that kind of a constellation or a network, then instead of asking again, well, where is design or where can I intervene? You begin to ask, what is design? And then what is my role in sort of opening up these critical spatial and social consciousness, sort of amplifying certain voices and or thinking about the scale of intervention as well.
Yeah. Which is very similar to, I think, this archival conversation, right? It's exactly
right. Yeah.
And this also actually ties back to one of the things that Pratiti had asked earlier about. We often, tend to think about archives in terms of trauma, in terms of violence. But how can we rethink archive differently? And when Kush mentioned the point about collectives, I think that's so important because we also need to think about archives as spaces of friendship. Right? And how do we go on doing that if we are engaging in that world making power that an archive has? So archives as friendship and something to keep thinking about.
Sritama, it's also like, how are we also writing ourselves into those archives?
Yes.
So as being part of queer collectives, when I cannot wait for any official sanctioning coming from or funding coming from anywhere else. But then how do you sustain yourself and sort of create a record, which is not for anyone else, but for us first?
Okay. So we're very lucky to be joined by people who have had long careers at the National Archives, one of whom is Tasadak Hussain. And Pratiti, your question, I want to bounce to Tasadak in the way of saying that, if we think of the National Archives as being these official national things of importance, right? What happens to popular stuff, right? Where else should we be looking to archive it? And does it also have a place in the National Archives? So may I ask you to unmute yourself, Tasadak? Sorry. Just a second, I think. It's not happening. Yes. You are on unmute. You can talk now, please.
Hello.
Yes, he can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, it's been a very interesting session, and I've been listening with rapt attention of the views of various scholars. And how do I begin? National Archives, well, I have put in about 30 years there and I'm just retired. So I thought somebody from the National Archives would be in this panel, but since nobody was there, I thought I volunteered to speak.
Very happy to have you. Thank you. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so yes, it's a premier institution, one of the biggest on the in the Southeast Asia, and the biggest in the eastern side of the Suez Canal. We have got records, something like 50 lakh files, running into about 220 crore pages. It's a huge volume of records, and scholars and students across the country and the world have been accessing records. And of course, I begin with Swati. You mentioned about that one incident of a person who's seeking something on the citizenship, right? Just would like to add that partition records are very important, and I'm just sharing some information on that. Recently, very recently, Ministry of Home Affairs has transferred about 10 lakh files. I underline 10 lakh files relating to relief and rehabilitation of the people who have been displaced. These records were lying in a record room under the Ministry of Home Affairs for a long, long time. And they have been recently transferred to National Archives. And in the coming years, it will take some time to, properly make proper references and then throw it open to the scholars. But that will take some time. So that is one aspect. The other aspect, we talked about the training part. Yes, it's very important. When I joined, I didn't have any formal training because that was many, many years back. But through experience, I've gained, whatever experience I've gained, I've shared. Because to build archives, it is also important for selection of records, So you have an archives, you have an archives administration back end, but what kind of archives you are building, that's also important. So we have the process of selecting records, and what the National Archives or the state archives in various states, they do is to select records from the various record creating agencies. So National Archives primarily focuses on the central government records, the various ministries, about 85 ministries scattered around the Raisina Hills in New Delhi. And so the process of appraisal, what records are to be created and to be called archival records is also important. So in the last 10, 15 years, we have been able to acquire about 10 lakh files from the various ministries, departments, and then we are trying to giving gradually access to these records. You scholars must also be aware that this portal called Patel, where we are trying to give access of records through digital medium.
Sir, I have a question actually for you, which was about what. So we understand the National Archives is the official repository, right? All the official declassified documents. Do people approach you with popular stuff, like if an individual is deceased and that collection needs to go somewhere? Let's say it's a collection of matchboxes, for instance, right? Would that have a space? Matchboxes or recipe books, right? Would there be a space in the National Archives for that?
That's an interesting observation. We have not had, but we have collected records of the eminent personalities of the eminent personalities in the private archives section. Of course, yes, okay. That is there.
Thank you so much, sir, for your input. Thank you. Aparna, you wanted to say something? Thank you, sir.
What I would like to add, you're talking about one scholar, I think Monica has mentioned about the opening of archives,
Yeah.
But again, I was part of a panel which tried to work out on a possibility of giving easier access to records.
Mm-hmm.
But we are governed by the Public Record Act 1993 and Public Record Rules 1997, wherein the word itself is the bona fide scholar. Anybody, not everybody, and every Tom, Dick, and Harry can come and consult records, but it is a bona fide scholar.
Yes.
So in our process, we try to change this term, bona fide scholar, to user of archives. But we had some issues with the ministry. So ultimately, that amendment has not taken place. Hopefully, some changes would come in the near future. But as of now, only the scholars, as per the Public Record Act, only the scholars would be given access. But we are open to public. We do have open house sessions. We exhibit our records through the exhibitions, and we invite. And I believe the Delhi University professors would be knowing that they have introduced a course on archives and museum in the undergrad 2 courses. So students have been coming to archives and they are getting a feel of archives and how we are maintaining the records, how we are giving access to scholars and all that. It's a very very vast discipline and
thank you, Sensei.
Exclusive.
Could you, sorry,
yes.
Could you tell us just very briefly a little more about that conversation to change that phrase bona fide scholar to user of archives? Could you tell us, no, is that confidential?
Oh, now I'm retired, so nothing has come out in the public domain. But yes, because the scholars across and public in general have been asking that we should be given access to records. So as of now, if somebody comes with a bona fide ID, maybe a Aadhaar card or a driving license, we do get access. But if you're going by the rules, it is still called it's bona fide scholars. You know, when you come and fill in the form, you know, it's the scholar and what subject of research. So this the common narratives like your genealogy and family history and stuff like that. So somebody wants to know.
Thank you, Sensei.
For that, it becomes a bit difficult.
I think we appreciate your energy to try to change the bona fide into everyone. So
yeah. And I think from here, our session is to shift to our final discussion, because this is a roundup of week-long sessions on, you know, archiving, how to teach about the archives, how to do the archiving and all of that. So between Maya and I, we were thinking that if we could create a laundry list of things that we would like to see done. I think one thing that has emerged in past 1 week is that we need an umbrella. I won't call it an organization, maybe an initiative, or maybe let's just call it a web page on which we can link up the other archives around India, but in a way that it is user-friendly. Because my problem with lots of these pages, and I have been compiling for past 7 days a list of resources, and now it's beginning to confound me, the document's running in 4 pages, that the moment I land on it, I don't know which ones to click.
Yeah.
It's an overload. And that's the thing with the digital. I just don't know. And then I do one, and then I'm stuck in it, and I, like, all my life is spent navigating only one. So that'll be my thing, that create a big sort of one Milli network, Milli consortium page, which gives you thematic stuff, links you to other things and all of that. But can we just now talk about, can we collect our thoughts from the last week, all of you who've been attending?
And I really request Dinesh and Padmini and Rochelle and people who've been really trying to do these building of tools, right, for so many years, to really come in on this one. And you understand our need pedagogically, that we cannot tell news stories if we can't, you know, sort of literally identify resources, right, from which to tell those stories. So hoping. Yeah. Padmini? Yes.
Hello.
Yes.
So yeah, well, anyway, I do want to say that thank you so much. I mean, thank you so much for this panel, and thank you everyone for an amazing week. I mean, I think this in and of itself has been hugely, I think it's moved us a great distance, which, you know, within a week, which is just amazing. And for some of us who have been kind of doing this for a while in much frustration, it has been very heartening. Also amazing to hear from and see the work students are doing and just their attitudes, and they're so tuned in and they really know what they're talking about. That's like, I think with Sangeeta on my panel, who's creating her own archive, it's just great to see that energy and that enthusiasm. I think to my mind, I would just push what I was saying, and this is obviously very much in the space that I work in, that to think a bit more imaginatively about, and this also speaks to what Aparna was just saying, to kind of think a bit more imaginatively as to how we present this content, like at the level of interface, because I think we're also, you know, we're also kind of falling into a rut of certain ways of seeing knowledge. And I think we, you know, and one of the affordances of the digital is to kind of do exciting things with that. And so that could be something very simple like mirroring. And I think, you know, I mentioned guerrilla archiving in the chat box. By that, what I mean is just mirroring an existing catalog and then, you know, scraping a catalog and then enriching it with your own metadata. right? Or to kind of create metadata that kind of responds to or challenges the narrative that that archive or that catalog puts forward. So that's one way to think of it. But the other way is just as to how we envision information and also how we get archives to speak to each other. I think for me, this is the ultimate question. Interoperability between archives is so essential because as we found, like there are so many organizations doing great work that we cannot find and cannot parse with enough context because archives don't speak to each other. I think one huge challenge, and we've had this conversation with regards to library catalogs, and this will be similar challenge with archives, is how do we accommodate Indian language content in archives and catalogs to make them interoperable, because when we transliterate or when we kind of, basically kind of try and encompass different Indian languages, the way, things like spelling variants, etc., can make it incredibly hard. So I think that is something that is a difficult question to address.
And also, Padmini, if I can ask a question about this, right? What about languages? Now, considering that, the effort to capture databases from across the country would mean, as you said, right, spelling variants and all of that. Is there a kind of a platform that's ever been envisioned that would allow for languages to talk to each other, in terms of...
So just now, I mean, there are people, Kalika Bali and Monaji Chaudhary, who are at MSR, do a lot of work with natural language processing. And so they've been doing some work in that space. Also, obviously, Google has done some work in that space, whether we like to acknowledge it or not. So when we've been doing OCR work with the 2 Centuries of Indian Print project, try as we might, we found that Google was doing the best possible job. And they have the most resources, so that means that they are most capable in that regard. But I think one way to also think about this is to capture Indian language content, say as recordings, say like as re-narrations, etc., but for the metadata to still be in English, which at least allows the archives to speak to each other. So at least, as a first step towards interoperability, I think that's something that we can definitely work towards. But again, and this brings back the question that we brought up a few days ago, is also about standards. We do not have interoperability standards that we can use in this country with our breadth of content and breadth of linguistic diversity. So I think there's some very base level essentials that we need to have in that laundry list. And then once we've kind of created those as a foundation, then I think a lot of the kind of work on top of that can build on top of that in useful ways. Because otherwise we'll still continue this kind of siloed existence. And I think that's what we want to, as we've definitely learned over the last week, we want to push against.
Absolutely. Dinesh, Bhanu, I think you're there. If you can jump in. I thought I saw.
Rochelle, would you like to
add? Just to say, what to echo what Padmini said, that you have these projects in different parts of the country that actually have raised the bar, in terms of what they did. But we don't have a platform where we are regularly talking to each other, nor do we have a sense that, say, people like you and, perhaps me, meeting in a way, is there a body I can keep addressing, right? Where I know that they're addressing 2 or 3 of the many questions that have arisen. So it's impossible to address all the questions that have come up in this session, right? Some of them are things that happen in the classroom, for instance. They're about interpretation and things. But the kind of questions that Padmini raised and the kinds of questions that people talk about, just about dealing with official archives, we lack a kind of civil society body that's just regularly there and present, that's raising that question. And that is, I think it's like a shocking lack, given the amount of sort of expertise and privilege that we have among us, that we don't have a forum that is always present. Either just to interact with archivists or with the government, to have historians on the board, that's a huge kind of gap. And I think it's easily filled if we just decide, look, this is the body and these are the 3 questions we're going to keep addressing. That's what.
We've had some participants since day
Hanu is here.
Yeah, can I say something? Yeah. Sorry, Dinesh, I happened to go to Tumkur, I think, on some urgency.
Okay.
But yeah, this week had been really engaging. Thanks to all the people.
Introduce yourself to everyone.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Banu. I work with Janastu. I am primarily a developer, but I do a lot of things. And working with archives since I started programming with scholars, researchers, archivists, and all the people. And yeah, it's been really engaging week for all the speakers, everyone who participated. It's really been amazing. I would like to just say a few things that is going along with the idea of the Milli. I think I want to reiterate what Aparna also said about how to educate each other, or there is a lot of, everyone is in their own small teams and groups and everything, but everyone has the same question, same challenges, same problems. And I think if we can collectively find a space, and if Milli is able to be that platform to address some of these problems that everyone face, including finding people to help, or if we are able to come up with a community based response to these problems that our community as archivists and everyone who are involved go through as in their daily life. I think that is one thing. And yeah, I mean, thanks for this whole thing.
No, thank you for creating Milli.link and whatnot that could offer the umbrella space, right? Since we were all wanting it to be neutral, right? This is the other thing. I think wherever we come from, we wanted to sort of stand under a common umbrella that belongs to nobody and yet belongs to everybody. So what Janastu has done in terms of just making these tools open, available, accessible, and usable, right, for us especially, we really appreciate. I know that these
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, sorry, one.
Sorry, you go ahead. I'm sorry. I'll
No, I think this has been a very sort of diverse week, right? Sometimes we have lawyers speaking and very technical sort of conversations and then very general conversations. So obviously this is not one channel. In that sense, it's already kind of multi-layered. But I think that we needed all these voices to kind of be heard, through the week in order to understand this is the level of what we need, right, to go forward. It will never come from one space alone. It doesn't get pushed. And honestly, yesterday was a shocking moment for me when I heard that no South Asian government had ever cooperated with each other, right, towards sort of bringing together whatever archival sources. And that tells us that this has to be, in a sense, citizen-led. So whatever Milli is, I hope that we feel that sort of joint responsibility and ownership to pushing that forward. Yeah, Bhan.
That's really great. And I think, yeah, that's what we usually get together in a very formal spaces, and I think it happens not to bring out our entire scope of what all we go through, because we are censored in a way to have a certain focus or perspectives. And that's why I think this week's session has been like really very engaging. I think everybody just came out with their bags open and put it out there on the table, and that's really great.
Absolutely, yeah. Aparna's calling on Pona and Malini, Hari, Yamaha. I really want to know who Yamaha is actually.
Let's thank the pandemic for this. We would have never done this, no?
Right.
It's so fond and condescended on doing a live YouTube kind of a thing and all that. And now here we are doing all this.
Yeah.
Well, some of you, we don't know what you look like, but you've been around. So I can spot some names that have been recurrent in past few weeks. So I just put them in the chat box asking you guys to speak up. Please do share your ideas.
I think I've been trying to message Imaya, but I can't reach Imaya.
See, we even pronounce the name.
Imaya?
We've been calling, we've been saying it as Imaha.
Okay.
Malini is there. Yes, Malini.
Hi.
Hi.
Finally, I've had a very bad connection. The internet has been very bad. So anyway, it's been wonderful for me. I could call myself an accidental archivist because I just, through my research, wandered and was doing an oral history of various urban planners in the country. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely, Malini. Yeah.
So, they were between 80 plus, all the first generation of urban planners. I'm an urban planner by training, so and I'm adjunct at IIT Bombay. So I teach a course on urban planning. It turns out that all of these older planners are interested in donating their material, their books, their, and so
Yes.
I was not ready for that. And so I've been now struggling to think of actually a physical space and a digitizing project and, all of these things. I've been wondering how to go about.
Right.
And so, I feel it's a very, very important material that I'm coming across, and therefore now thinking about this whole archiving business and how does one set up maybe a planning archive for India and where to house it and all of that, whether they should be local, whether they should be a hub and spoke kind of scenario, etc. So it's been very, very good for me to hear all of this, as I'm beginning this process, and I'll definitely reach out to Milli. I was fortunate, I learned about it only at the end of the first day, so I missed the first day.
It's on YouTube forever. So,
yes. Okay. So thank you. It's been a wonderful, wonderful week. I've tried to catch most of the sessions. Yeah.
I want to sort of, Malini, really sort of echo what you're saying, because there's the story of Anjali Nerlikar, who was basically given an entire archive of poetry, the whole Bombay poets in the 50s, 60s, their kind of materials, and nobody really came up to agree to take it. And so now that collection is housed at Cornell University, and this was not her first choice, she's the first to say it. And I hope that this is not the story that is infinitely repeated, right? So I really appreciate, in the sense, Aparna Subramaniam's point also, but what about the materialities of this? And I understand that in the absence of ideal conditions, we will make do with digital, replicas, but honestly, the originals also belong, back here. So this is to do with funding structures and, and I think even Venkat's initiative to sort of archive institutional histories will speak to your urban planning, archives. But please, I wish there's a way to articulate our need and then to collectively find solution to how that need can be addressed. So please,
we will stay in touch. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We have about 4 minutes left. So now I'm going to share my screen. And this is literally to call on all the wonderful people who have been a part of this effort. And I'm going to call them one by one. If you're here, please switch on your video so everyone can wave to you. Aparna. Okay. Yes. I don't know if Achal is here. I'm sharing, no? Yeah. Yeah. Avehi. Okay. Bhanu we just heard from. Yeah. Deepika. I'm doing a very bad job of this. Sorry. Actually, you know what, Aparna, can you read the names?
Yeah, sure. Achal Pandya, IGNCA, me, myself, and me again. Avehi Anand, Sarmaya Arts Foundation, Mumbai. Anu Prakash from Janastu. Deepika from ISC Bangalore. Dinesh from Janastu again. Divij Joshi, Mozilla Fellow. Faisal from Keystone Foundation. Hari from Archives at NCBS. Maya Dodd, Flame University. Mridalini M, Intact CKP Bangalore. Nived Dharmaraj, Flame University. Padmini Ray Murray from Design Beku. Is that? Onarasu from IIT Madras. Prasoon is an independent fellow researcher person. Priyanka, the Partition Museum. Ranjini from Keystone Foundation. Sangeeta from Archives NCBS. Shalom from Archives NCBS. Shubhajit Archives. These are young students, so please, are really heartfelt thanks to them. Shubhajit Archives at NCBS. Swati Chawla from OP Jindal. Swecha Poladi from Archives NCBS. Varuni Archives NCBS. Venkat is the sort of heart and soul of this. It was really his initiative and we all got on board. So thank you for that, Venkat. Archives at NCBS and Vrunda Pathare from Godrej Archives.
So I would like, sorry, Aparna.
And thank you for putting this together. We didn't know we were in for this. Thank you.
Okay. So I think, Venkat, we have 2 minutes to go. So you can wrap up this week in the way you began it.
Yeah. Mind you, everybody should know he organized this online thing without an online connection, without an internet connection.
Yeah, he's dead to his phone.
What is he on about? He's organized this. Doesn't have
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Thanks so much to everyone. I mean, I think the only reason well,
I could find that sweet spot, yeah, in your house.
See, this is what we were saying.
Yes.
My respect for I can't believe it actually just went up.
You're audible.
Also, unstable connections. I don't know if you guys can hear me anyway. Sorry.
But maybe if you turn off your video, it might help. Your bandwidth might get balanced to stream your audio.
Video's off, no? I think.
I can see him.
Oh, you can see him also.
But the video is frozen.
Stop video. I'm stopping his video. Yeah. Yeah, Venkat.
Yeah,
Hari, would you like to step in instead? Hari or Dinesh? A soft-spoken South Indian man. You are muted, Hari.
So do you want me to try and guess what Venkat might have said in the situation?
Yes,
That's going to be difficult.
exactly.
No, so I'll just say that, yeah, I mean, Venkat, as he said yesterday as well, he just put this idea out a short while before this actually happened. And it's quite incredible to see all the people who have joined in. I'll speak on my behalf. I mean, I'm a relative newcomer to this. I'm an ecologist by training, and this has been quite an incredible opportunity for me to, meet this community. And also, there's so many different ways in which the work of the archives resonates with the work that scientists and ecologists do, and we're completely unaware of it. And so I think those connections are also important, in addition to connections between the archives, but connections to other fields of academia. And so this has been a really nice opportunity, and thank you all. Let me see, Venkat. Venkat, are you there? Hello. I think he's typing. No, I think you've lost him. No, Maya, I think you should
give up. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I was gonna call him on the phone, and we do things uniquely around here.
Richa, Sangeeta, the youngest students who just helped us through this. Do you want to come in, say something? Tell us about the bombing and how it scared the hell out of us. Deepika?
We got bombed yesterday too, right? Towards the end.
That was Venkat. His audio was on and some other meeting started at his end.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But she did use the word bomb and I got scared and I shut it down. So, okay. So we will hope for, some parting words of wisdom. But really, there is no parting because this is online anyway, and we will see each other frequently now, it seems, since we have a Zoom account. And also, I think the reading group will keep, bring us back in terms of a common focus. So really, honestly, thank you. This was so amazing. Is somebody gonna?
Venkat is back. Maybe you want to try him again.
Venkat has just joined in.
Okay.
He's connected to
I
audio.
don't see his mic being switched on though. I can't see the icon.
He's right at the end.
This is like every family Zoom meeting, where the senior citizens are patiently led into the meeting.
Okay. Connected to audio.
Yeah?
Let's see. Let's give him a few seconds.
Okay. Yeah. But I've made a bit of a checklist in terms of what people said about, what they would like to see happen. And in terms of priority, these are the 3 areas that I think found the most echo. And I do believe we need to work on this. So, we talked about forming subgroups or whatever in terms of just getting the stuff out there. Of course, this is a fully volunteer effort, and we'll do it because we believe it's for the collective good. Yeah, so there isn't really, I think, Padmini, your sign up sheet can perhaps then be used for, working on these other issues also.
And if there is, many of us are, I just want to sort of flag this point. Many of us are really stretched. I had boys in the room with me all the time and all of that. And, Maya and I keep sharing about all these food troubles we have and, getting the food organized, putting it on the table, managing the kids. And so if there are folks here with less sort of day-to-day family sort of thing to be lifting at this time, especially during the time of pandemic, if you could just, we need more labor. We need people who can, it's
carry
not
it.
Time. It's about, getting that extra thing done. So it'd be nice to have other people chip in. Some people who are retired or who have other people organizing the food.
Right. Bringing food to the table, putting food on the table, all of it. Yeah. Yeah. So I think this is going to definitely see a lot more of the volunteer spirit we've witnessed. Right. It was very rushed. Let's be honest. This was done during lockdown. It was crazy busy, and yet it happened. And I think it's at a scale and at an impact that was unimaginable had any one of us done it in our own kind of local ways. So obviously, I think this is about it gathering more momentum, and really will need more hands on deck for that.
Also, I have to say this is really personal. For those of us who are living in the US now in a lockdown and wouldn't be home anytime soon, and actually missing the community of the university in so many ways, I can't tell you how important this is to me right now, because I'm an extrovert and I don't do well when I'm learning alone. So having this community of scholars to talk and discuss such things and also to think through so many important questions is really, really helpful.
Now I can see Venkat's mic icon.
Yeah. Please have the last word, Venkat.
I'm going to try, but I'm very sorry. I have a very bad connection. Not sure if you can hear me.
Yes.
Can hear you.
Can I just ask Maya, Aparna, Hari, Sangeeta, any of you just to wrap this up? Sorry, I don't want this to end on a bad connection.
Venkat, just type your farewell to everyone.
Yeah, yeah.
Let us go home.
So yeah, so Bhanu, I think since you're the kind of default home of Milli right now in this meeting, if there's any way anybody wants to help or just be involved, would you have any way of sort of speaking to that?
Yeah, I think the first point would be just to reach out, email or one-on-one. However, if you find my phone number also, call, whatever is fine. But if we want to document our engagement in the sense of what was happening and going on, I would suggest we all also could get on the GitHub link that I had shared, like posting suggestions or whatever else. I think however else one wants to contribute, or by writing about or a wiki thing, or it could be anything. And also we need more people for building, coding, or infrastructure, or research scholars, all of them. So I want to leave it that I can paste the link again in the chat.
Yes, please.
So, and I hope we can use it like our Twitter or Facebook. That's how I keep pushing GitHub into all spaces. Just
okay.
so,
Yeah.
so
actually,
I'll
you're
keep
very
doing that.
It has to be shared in many ways. I think in terms of going forward, there are three things which are really emerging concretely. One is the compilation of pedagogy resources. Sritama is very sweetly offering to kind of put this, space. The second thing has been the reading group. I mean, I think this is really going to take life soon. And the third thing is something that I had requested of Venkat earlier, and Nonica, I would really appreciate you also getting on board with this, is that if we could start with almost some digital learning tools for like, on archives. So in terms of the fact that we're using these platforms, when we have a YouTube channel, for instance, even some sort of short modules that orient people in terms of archival work, it would go a great long way for all of our undergraduate students and other students in the country. So between these three efforts, I hope this is the beginning of something grander and greater and way more impactful than our tiny community. But I believe that it takes, a few to start. So in that sense, we are those few, but it's been going on for a long time, the expression of need and hopefully the development of this structure. So thank you, everyone. I say this on behalf of the entire bunch of people who constitute Milli Network today and tomorrow, in terms of really giving us so much and being so generous, honestly, with your time and with your attention. On that note, I will ask, the Milli Network to stop recording and then we